The Second Seal. Academy of Death. Book 2. Chapter 1. Deliverance threw punch after punch at Roman, punctuating her words with her movement. I don't want to talk about it. She made 3 sharp jabs in quick succession, letting out a frustrated snarl, but Roman easily blocked all 3. She took a step back, panting from her efforts. Roman stood up straight to watch her steadily. He had barely even broken a sweat, and yet Deliverance was winded and sore. She obviously had a long way to go yet in her self-defense training. "We should take a break," he said stiffly, turning away from their practice mat. It was petty, but Deliverance stepped toward him and aimed a kick at his legs to sweep his feet out from under him. Her shin met nothing but air as he sidestepped her movement and cuffed her on the shoulder to send her sprawling. She landed on her back. The air rushed out of her lungs in a whoosh, and she decided it would be best to stay laying down for a while. Roman leaned over her, one eyebrow raised. "Break?" She nodded, having no air to form words, and listened to his footsteps as he moved away from her. He quickly returned with 2 water bottles, and she sat up so that she could guzzle from hers. Roman sipped his almost primly, and she glared at him. Deliverance knew that he had years of formal training to become a guardian, and that she shouldn't beat herself up too much about him practically mopping the floor with her, but she had to admit that it stung her pride a bit. She had thought she would at least put up a fight, even if it was scrappy and sloppy, but it hadn't been a strain for him at all. His breathing was almost meditative, and her screaming lungs made her want to scream in turn, but she didn't even have enough air for that. It was pathetic, and she knew it. "You're progressing quite well for being so early in your training," Roman said formally, and Deliverance rolled her eyes at him. "Don't spare my feelings, Roman. I'm terrible at fighting, and you know it. You have promise." "Promise isn't good enough," she snapped back, making. Roman raised an eyebrow again. She sighed, "Forget it. Maybe I'm just not cut out for self-defense. It won't help when Pascal squishes me like a bug, but at least I won't have to witness the end of the world." She flopped onto her back and whistled softly, and soon enough a solid black flying squirrel landed on her chest. Jet scurried down her arm and circled her wrist like a fuzzy comfort bracelet, and Deliverance let out a sigh. At least she had her familiar on her side. Maybe he could actually latch onto Pascali's face long enough for Deliverance to land a punch. "Deliverance," Roman said hesitantly, making her sit up curiously, "I hope you won't mind, but I submitted a request to my guard captain to be your long-standing chaperone for trips into Hawthorne. I understand if you wish for me to retract my request so that you could have a different guardian, but I thought you should know of my current request." Deliverance stared at him, still processing such a lengthy speech. She didn't think she had ever heard Roman string so many words together at one time, or even as many as they had exchanged in the entirety of their brief relationship. You don't have to retract your request," she said, giving him a smile. "I'd actually really appreciate your company. Since I have to have a chaperone, I'd rather it be someone I know, and I know you'll get me out of any trouble I get in." Her smile turned into a smirk. "I'm sure you've noticed, I'm a bit of a magnet for trouble." Roman smiled back, a small one but still an actual smile, and Deliverance tried not to gape. "Who are you, and what have you done with Roman?" she muttered, not wanting to break the surreal moment but having to say something. Roman chuckled, and Deliverance flopped back on the mat. Would wonders never cease? A smile and a laugh? She was starting to think Roman was actually a big softy, which was jarring to say the least. Her first impression of the Guardian had been of a brick wall with no sense of humor, but it was starting to seem like he had a personality after all. "Thank you, Roman," she said softly, scratching between Jet's ears idly, "for the self-defense lessons and for putting up with me in general." "Of course." Chapter 2. Jet detached himself from her wrist and zapped into his finch form, flying out of her sight. She craned her neck to see while still lying on her back, and she saw an upside-down Oliver walking toward her. He held out an arm for Jet to land on, and her familiar immediately zapped into his favorite mouse form. Deliverance smiled. She and Oliver were getting closer all the time, and even though he was still only her almost boyfriend, she was pleased with their relationship. She looked forward to seeing where it would go. She scrambled up from the mat, wincing at the soreness developing in her shoulders, and closed the distance between her and Oliver, giving him a quick kiss. "You're early," she said, stepping back so she could look into his copper eyes. Oliver gave her a curious smile. "I'm actually running a few minutes late." She blinked at him, then whirled around to look at the rec hall's wall clock. Oliver was right, they were running late. "Fuck, let me go change really quick before we go see Renov. Give me a few minutes?" Oliver nodded, reaching out so that Jet could use his arm as a bridge back to her. She waved to Roman, then jogged to the locker room. Quickly, she found her stuff and started stripping off her clothes. Jet zapped into his salamander form and watched her expectantly. "Sorry, buddy. No time for a shower today, we'll have to wait until we get back to the dorms." Jet zapped back into his mouse form and squeaked at her, probably pouting. All his squeaks sounded the same, but she was getting used to Jet's body language and general attitude. Or attitude problem, as some would say. Her uniform on, she shouldered into her blazer last, and then threw her hair into a messy ponytail before leaving the locker room. Roman was already gone, but she saw Oliver leaning casually against the wall, tapping quickly on his phone, probably playing a game or something. He caught sight of her and grinned, pocketing his phone. They linked hands, and then hurried to the classrooms where Professor Renov was waiting for them. Roman had kicked her ass in physical self-defense, but now it was time for magical defense. Deliverance had been nervous all weekend, wondering what kind of magic she would be learning from her professor, but it was mostly overwhelmed by excitement. One concern she couldn't shake was the prospect of testing the limits of her blood witch magic. She hadn't had the best track record of reliability where her magic was concerned, and it still sparked out of control when she was anxious, but maybe Renov would be able to help her get better control over her magic. She and Oliver reached the practicum chamber and hurried inside, where they found Professor Renov fussing with what looked like plants and rocks. "Ah, there you are," she said in greeting. "I'm almost done gathering the herbs and crystals we will be starting with today. Go ahead and set down your things. I'll just be a moment." Renov turned to scan the shelves, flouncing along them while she searched their contents. Deliverance and Oliver did as she asked, setting their backpacks down by the work table covered in the different materials before taking seats. Their hands met under the table, and their fingers laced together. She remembered her and Oliver's first interaction in the practicum chamber, and heat rose to her face. Things had gotten hot and heavy fast, the sparks between them fanned into flames. She had slowed them down, letting the heat return to coals, and then she had completed the summoning spell that had brought Jet into her life. It had also brought Koi and the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse into her life, but she tried to focus on the positive. Renov clapped her hands together just like she did at the beginnings of lectures in her normal classes, drawing their attention to where she stood on the other side of the table. All crystals must be charged, preferably by moonlight, except for selenite. She raised a jagged rod of white crystal, and then set it down in the center of the table. In a pinch, it can be used to charge other crystals. Professor Renov?" Deliverance asked, eyeing the pile of crystals they had yet to go through. "No offense, but how are these rocks going to help against Pascal?" Renov looked at her critically, then handed her a brown stone with bright amber stripes running through it. Deliverance held it up to the light, and then Renov made a pushing motion with her hands, and Deliverance felt a blast of energy whipping toward her. She flinched away from the magic blast as it approached her, enveloped her, and then moved around her. She looked up at Renov, who was casually straightening the sleeves of her flowy shirt. The professor held a hand out, and Deliverance returned the stone, blinking at it warily. "Tiger's eye," Renov said into the heavy silence, "is inherently protective. My spell was very small, just a bit of wind really, but the stone diverted the magic away from you as the one holding it. These rocks, Ms. Mackey, when infused with intent and training, may very well save your life one day." Deliverance nodded silently, and then Renove ran her and Oliver through a crash course in basic crystal magic. It was a lot to remember, even with her frantic note-taking, and her head was spinning by the time they reached the last one. Then, to Deliverance's dismay, the professor swept the pile of herbs toward them and picked up the first of many stems. She stifled a groan and returned to her notebook, frantically taking notes to review later. There were leaves and flowers and bark and roots, but if even one of those stupid plants could help them against Pascal, then she would memorize every last one. She would hate every second, but she'd do it. Chapter 3. Renove finally lifted the last stem, white sage used for purification via smudging, and then she took out a piece of paper from a folder on the table with them. She pushed the paper toward Deliverance and Oliver, angling it so that it was between them. This, she said, is a basic warding spell. It will create a very small dome of protection around the caster, and can be expanded according to the amount of magic channeled into the spell. Read through the words, practice enunciation amongst yourselves, and once I've put everything back in their proper places, we will attempt to cast today. Renove began gathering the materials to put them back, and Deliverance's heart sank. She had no idea what her magic would do, what with its general volatility, and so she would need to keep an extra tight grip on her concentration for the duration of the spell. Jet must have sensed her inner turmoil, because he scurried out from her pocket in his mouse form, and moved to her shoulder where he could press his little mouse nose to the shell of her ear. With a steadying breath, Deliverance turned her attention to the paper Renove had given them. It was short and to the point. Magic of my own, come near, create a circle center here, of all the magic cast at me none shall pass, so mote it be. She and Oliver practiced saying the words, finding an appropriate cadence and enunciating as clearly as possible, and too soon Renove was back and looking at them expectantly. Oliver, why don't you go first? Oliver nodded, and moved to the center of the practicum chamber. He took a deep breath, and let it out slowly, holding his hands before him and steepling his fingers in an inverted V shape beneath his chin. Magic of my own, come near, create a circle center here, of all the magic cast at me none shall pass, so mote it be. He spoke the words, his voice deeper and richer when infused with magic, and his copper eyes flashed brightly. Deliverance watched in awe, as faint orange lines began winding in a circle around Oliver's feet. She watched him close his eyes and push his hands down and away from himself, making the lines pulse brighter and begin to climb off the ground. His brow wrinkled in concentration, and his eyes closed as he fought to channel his magic, and with a final push, the lines converged above his head in a glittering dome of writhing orange tendrils. He opened his eyes and looked up at the dome, smiling at his achievement, and caught Deliverance's eye. The pulsing light made his eyes look like copper coins, glinting and bright, and he grinned at her before letting the ward drop. Renove clapped her hands together and beamed. Excellent, Oliver, and your first try too. Okay, now Deliverance. Your turn. Deliverance took Oliver's place in the center of the chamber, and urged Jet back into her pocket. She took a calming breath and closed her eyes to center herself. They had learned in Renove's class that a witch's magical stance was not set in stone. There were common forms, such as Oliver's steepled approach, but it didn't work for Deliverance. Instead, she had been drawn to the sphere center. She held her hands as if cupping water with them, and then moved her hands upward as if grasping a sphere. Magic of my own, come near, create a circle center here, of all the magic cast at me none shall pass, so mote it be. She felt her magic begin responding to the spell, and she held the connection until she was sure it was established. Then she slowly began drawing her hands out, as if the sphere she held was getting larger. Deliverance imagined the size of the sphere corresponding with the strength of the magic she was channeling, and she pushed until her hands were about a foot apart. She opened her eyes, trying to walk a line between not enough magic and too much, and the glowing lines of the ward slowly began taking shape around her. She pushed a little bit more, and the same tendrils Oliver had conjured began rising off the ground around her, but then she saw sparks beginning to wind around her fingers, and in her panic she lost hold of the ward. Chapter 4. The lines fizzled out, and she was left in a circle of nothing. She couldn't even manage a simple warding spell without her magic frizzing out on her. She darted a look at Renove, who was looking at her critically. Oliver, the professor said, may we have a moment alone? Oliver looked perplexed but nodded, and opened the door to let himself into the hallway, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Deliverance, why are you holding back? She shook her head, not sure how to explain the volatility of her magic, but she didn't a chance to form a response before Renove started talking again. I saw the sparks on your hands, Miss Mackey. I doubt Oliver did, but that's because he didn't know what to look for. Your magic is controlling you, where it should be the other way around. Deliverance was shocked into silence. Professor Rove was right, of course, but she hadn't expected her to say it point blank. She looked at Renove guiltily. Professor, I know you're right. She hung her head low. But I don't know what I can do about it. I'm too new at all of, she waved her hands to encompass all of her surroundings. She huffed. It's obvious I don't stand a fighting chance against Pascal, and so I don't want to hurt anyone by trying to be a blood witch. You are a blood witch. You're just untrained. That's what this academy, all academies are for. Renove's stare softened. You aren't the first student who has been afraid of their potential, and you certainly won't be the last. I'm not. She was afraid. That's what it all boiled down to, and to say anything different amounted to a bold-faced lie. In response to her realization, Jet zapped into his flying squirrel form and took up his position on her wrist as a comfort bracelet. Okay, fine. She scoffed more at herself than anything or anyone else. I'm afraid. Deliverance felt inadequate, as if anything she did wouldn't matter, wouldn't put a dent or take a bite out of the current situation at hand. I'm useless, she thought, a good-for-nothing useless blood witch with chaotic powers. But aren't you? You're the ones who keep telling me I'm a big, bad Class 5 magic user. Roman has to watch me outside of the wards for fuck's sake, and I know it's not just for kicks. She sighed and sank into one of the chairs. Renove sat down a moment later, and idly fiddled with one of the crystals on the table. Together, she and the professor sat in silence for a few minutes. Deliverance wanted to break it, but for once, she couldn't think of anything to say. No sarcastic response or brush off with humor. There was nothing she could say to make this problem smaller. It's something we can work on, Renove said softly, but it's a two-way street. I can't help you control your magic if you're constantly keeping it from coming out. We don't have to do it today. We should probably let Oliver back inside, but I would like you to consider what I've said. That's all I'm asking right now. Deal? Deliverance nodded. Her eyes remained fixed on the table. Deal. Renove moved to the door, less flouncy than usual, and opened it for Oliver before speaking to both of them. I think that's enough instruction for our first day. There's about half an hour before your next classes begin, and so I believe this would be a good time to visit the dining hall. Remember, magic is taxing both physically and mentally. Make sure you're eating regularly and staying hydrated to keep up your strength. Run along now, and I'll see you both in class tomorrow morning. She flounced out the door, then Oliver walked over to retrieve his things. Deliverance did the same, moving mechanically, but was brought out of her haze by Oliver's hand gently resting on her arm. You okay? He asked simply. Yeah, just tired. Renove is right, you know, we should probably get some food. Oliver smiled tentatively, and she smiled back. It was a small smile, the best she could do at the moment, but Oliver took her hand anyway and laced their fingers together. Together they walked out the door, and Deliverance paused briefly to look back at the practicum chamber. I might be out of my league, she thought, but I won't give up. She was in this no matter what. I must try harder. Chapter 5. Deliverance looked at Renove, and guilt ate away at her. Professor, I know you're right. She hung her head low. But I don't know what I can do about it. I'm too new at all of, she waved her hands to encompass all of her surroundings. She huffed. It's obvious I don't stand a fighting chance against Pascal, and so I don't want to hurt anyone by trying to be a blood witch. You are a blood witch. You're just untrained. That's what this academy, all academies are for. Renault's stare softened. You aren't the first student who has been afraid of their potential, and you certainly won't be the last. I'm not. She was afraid. That's what it all boiled down to, and to say anything different amounted to a bald-faced lie. In response to her realization, Jet zapped into his flying squirrel form and took up his position on her wrist as a comfort bracelet. Okay, fine. She scoffed more at herself than anything or anyone else. I'm afraid. Deliverance felt inadequate, as if anything she did wouldn't matter, wouldn't put a dent or take a bite out of the current situation at hand. I'm useless. She thought, a good-for-nothing useless blood witch with chaotic powers. But aren't you? You're the ones who keep telling me I'm a big, bad Class 5 magic user. Roman has to watch me outside of the wards for fuck's sake, and I know it's not just for kicks. She sighed and sank into one of the chairs. Renault sat down a moment later and idly fiddled with one of the crystals on the table. They sat in silence for a few minutes, and Deliverance wanted to break it, but for once she couldn't think of anything to say. No sarcastic response or brush off with humor. There was nothing she could say to make this problem smaller. It's something we can work on, Renault said softly, but it's a two-way street. I can't help you control your magic if you're constantly keeping it from coming out. We don't have to do it today. We should probably let Oliver back inside, but I would like you to consider what I've said. That's all I'm asking right now. Deal? Deliverance nodded. Her eyes remained fixed on the table. Deal. Renault moved to the door, less flouncy than usual, and opened it for Oliver before speaking to both of them. I think that's enough instruction for our first day. There's about half an hour before your next classes begin, so I believe this would be a good time to visit the dining hall. Remember, magic is taxing both physically and mentally. Make sure you're eating regularly and staying hydrated to keep up your strength. Run along now, and I'll see you both in class tomorrow morning. She flounced out the door, then Oliver walked over to retrieve his things. Deliverance did the same, moving mechanically, but was brought out of her haze by Oliver's hand gently resting on her arm. You okay? He asked simply. Yeah, just tired. Renault is right, you know, we should probably get some food. Oliver smiled tentatively, and she smiled back. It was a small smile, the best she could do at the moment, but Oliver took her hand anyway and laced their fingers together. They walked out the door, and Deliverance paused briefly to look back at the practicum chamber. She was so out of her league, but she couldn't give up now. She was in this no matter what, so she at least had to try. They left the building, neither one of them saying a word. Instead, they walked hand in hand silently, both of them digesting all that had happened. Deliverance felt a weight off her shoulders. She'd done it, made it through her first year at the academy. She had so much more to learn and to do, but for the moment she was satisfied knowing that she had taken her first step. Oliver squeezed her hand, and she smiled, looking forward to what the future would bring. They walked into the night and towards their future, a future of mystery and magic as only an academy could provide. The stars shone brightly above them, reminding Deliverance of all the possibilities that awaited her. And she knew, no matter what challenges may come, she had the strength and courage to face them, because this was only the beginning of Deliverance's journey. The two of them stepped into a new world, an adventure that would take them to places they never could have imagined before now. For Oliver and Deliverance, the future was nothing but exciting. Together they could face any obstacle and bask in the endless possibilities of their new world. Chapter 6. In the dining hall, Deliverance poked at her food more than she ate. Dividing her mixed vegetables, she pushed her peas to one corner of the tray, carrots to another, then the pale lima beans yet to a third section. I picked up a few new base words to a language I'm learning. Oliver tried to engage her in conversation. That's nice. She skewered nothing but peas on one side of her fork, then little pieces of carrot on the other side. Jet had been prodding her with his little mouse nose, but she couldn't help but stew in her thoughts. Fuck, Oliver muttered, drawing Deliverance from her reverie. Not now, he whispered. She looked up and came face to face with a bright-eyed Lexi. Oliver frowned at her, but her attention was solely on Deliverance. She was so not in the mood for bitchy ex-girlfriend hour. She blinked at Lexi, schooling her face into a mask of indifference, and waited for the she-devil to speak first. She didn't have to wait long. Deliverance, you'll be coming to Hawthorne this weekend, right? What the fuck? Yes. That's generally where we all go. Every weekend. And Oliver will be with you? And your little familiar, of course, he practically sticks to you like glue. Jet zapped into his salamander form, and raised his tail in what Deliverance believed was a fuck you, and she almost applauded. She wondered if Jet's salamander form was poisonous, and she wondered if he'd be willing to try it out on Lexi. They could both plead innocent, of course. Yes, Lexi, Jet will be with me. Will your familiar be coming, too? I haven't seen him yet, but let me guess. Is he a Pomeranian? Chihuahua? Some other bratty little dog whose bark is worse than its bite. Lexi's smirk twitched out of place for a moment, but it quickly returned, and Deliverance didn't like the cruel glint in her eyes. Whatever was coming wouldn't be good. I've heard you'll have another person coming with you on weekends. What's his name, Roman? And correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't he your babysitter since you're a, she gasped in mock horror, Class 5 magic user? Deliverance felt the blood drain from her face, and chanced a quick look at Oliver, who shook his head quickly. She had no idea how Lexi had found out about her magic status, but she felt vulnerable and painfully aware of the curious eyes in the dining hall watching their conversation. She gritted her teeth, leveling a glare at Lexi. Did you want something, Lexi? You're ruining my appetite. Oh no, I don't want anything, Lexi said brightly. I just wanted to tell Oliver how brave he is for being with such a volatile magic user. He's never been the brave type, always so bookish, but we love that about him, don't we? Deliverance tried not to flinch from Lexi's words, and kept her eyes averted from Oliver. Why wasn't he saying anything? The silence was deafening, and Lexi let it stretch for a few long moments before flipping her hair and beaming at them. I'll be on my way. You two enjoy. Her words turned into a shriek as Jet zapped into his finch form and began buffeting her with his little black wings. Lexi swatted at him in vain, spinning in circles and generally looking ridiculous, until Jet decided he had done his part and returned to the table. He preened his feathers innocently, while Lexi swiped fingers through her now disheveled hair. She glared at their group and then stalked off. Delivery let out a relieved sigh and looked at Oliver. Well, that was unexpected. Oliver smiled ruefully. Yes, it certainly was. But I'm glad Jet saved us from having to answer her question. Deliverance nodded in agreement, and they both shared a smile as they watched Jet flit from person to person, inspecting their plates for the tastiest morsels. It looks like we have another unexpected guest for dinner, Oliver said with a chuckle. It appears so, Deliverance grinned and picked a few crumbs from her plate to offer Jet as an apology. He certainly knows how to make an entrance, Oliver said. Deliverance laughed and patted Jet on the head. That he does. With that, they all tucked into their meal, pleased to have something else to focus on besides Lexi's presence. Life was full of surprises, some of them enjoyable, and it was best just to take them in stride. Chapter 7. Jet zapped back into his mouse form and began nudging at Deliverance's hand. She scooped him up, kissing him on his furry little forehead and laughing softly. She then looked pointedly at Oliver, who was carefully avoiding her glare. He rubbed the back of his neck, the tips of his ears burning, and Deliverance huffed. She stood, shouldering her backpack and snatching her tray from the table. Jet zapped into his flying squirrel form and played bracelet. We have a meeting with Professor Hawthorne in 15 minutes, she said briskly, annoyed when Oliver still wouldn't look at her. I'll meet you there. She spun on her heel and left the dining hall alone. As she crossed the courtyard, Deliverance petted Jet distractedly. For being her almost boyfriend, Oliver really hadn't played his part very well, and it hurt more than Deliverance thought it would. Sure, she could stand up for herself. She had faced her share of mean girls in the past, but Oliver had just sat there. It was disappointing. She arrived at Professor Hawthorne's empty classroom and peeked inside. He was writing on his whiteboard with his back to her, so she decided she would stay in the hall to wait for Oliver. She still didn't know Professor Hawthorne very well, and even though Oliver was being kind of an ass, he and the professor had a much better relationship. "You may come in if you'd like, Ms. Mackey." She whipped around and saw that Professor Hawthorne hadn't paused in copying Latin conjugations. It figured, stupid vampires and their stupidly perfect hearing. And smell, probably, but Deliverance decided not to think about that. She crossed the threshold and hovered just in the doorway. Professor Hawthorne turned his head just enough to make eye contact, and he smiled gently. "I don't bite, Ms. Mackey." She blanched at the phrase, and he grinned, flashing his elongated canines at her. "Sorry, bad joke. Please come in and have a seat. Is Oliver on his way?" Yes, he'll be here in a few minutes." Deliverance sat at the desk she usually claimed during her Latin class and clasped her hands in front of her. Jet tightened his grip, obviously attuned to her frazzled emotions. She took a few deep breaths, slowing her breathing and letting her heart rate return to a normal rhythm. She really needed to stop letting Lexi get under her skin. She wasn't worth it. A knock on the open door made Deliverance look up, and she saw Oliver standing in the doorway, giving her puppy dog eyes. Deliverance quickly decided she was still mad at him, and coolly turned her gaze forward toward the board and the professor. Professor Hawthorne's eyes flitted between the two of them, obviously picking up on the tension. "Hello, Oliver. Please take a seat. I have a class in a few minutes, but we will have plenty of time for a quick discussion." Oliver sank into the desk immediately next to Deliverance, and she didn't even spare him a glance. She mentally high-fived herself for not giving in to his copper puppy dog eyes. "Now, Headmaster Helms has taken the liberty of bringing me up to date on the events that have transpired since your arrival, Deliverance. I'm sure you are aware that Oliver is an allogist witch, which is why I wanted to meet with you both. His natural gift with languages, paired with my long-standing study of them, could be useful in our dealings with the horsemen." Deliverance cocked her head curiously. She had figured that Professor Hawthorne's request for a meeting was related to the horsemen, but how could languages help them? She glanced at Oliver, and could tell he was thinking the same thing. Professor Hawthorne must have noticed, though, as she quickly followed up with a more detailed explanation. "The horsemen are known to communicate in an ancient language that very few people living today can understand. I think it might be possible for us to decipher their true intentions if we can find a way to understand their language. That's why I wanted the two of you here today." Deliverance and Oliver looked at each other, both slightly taken aback by what Professor Hawthorne had just told them. They both knew that it would be a difficult task, but one that was vitally important for the success of their mission. "Do you think we can do it?" Deliverance asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. Professor Hawthorne smiled kindly at them both and nodded. "I believe in the two of you, and I'm confident that if anyone can do this, it's you." She looked from one to the other, her eyes searching their faces for any signs of doubt. Finding none, she continued. "All you need is a little help and guidance from me, and I'm sure you'll be able to crack the code of their language in no time." Deliverance and Oliver glanced at each other again, both with newfound determination blazing in their eyes. It was time to get to work. They had a mission to accomplish, and they were determined to see it through no matter what. With Professor Hawthorne's help, the two of them quickly got down to business, poring over data in an effort to find clues that would lead them closer to understanding the mysterious language of their adversaries. Day after day, they worked diligently, slowly piecing together the puzzle until one day, finally, it all made sense. They had cracked the code. With newfound confidence and clarity of understanding, Deliverance and Oliver marched into battle, ready to take on whatever came their way, all thanks to Professor Hawthorne's guidance and wisdom. Chapter 8. In order to find the first seal, Professor Hawthorne said, You turned to the Book of Revelation, correct? Do you remember the version you used? Oliver answered for her, King James. Professor Hawthorne nodded. I figured as much. It's the most widespread version of the Christian Bible. What I'm proposing is that Oliver and I review some of the other translations of Revelation. Not many people know this, but translation is more often than not heavily influenced by the translator. Deliverance stared at him. She hadn't known that. She had just assumed that translating something meant taking words and copying them verbatim in another language. Professor Hawthorne sighed. Unfortunately, humans have and have always had a tendency to skew whatever they touch so that it better suits their needs. He leaned forward and steepled his fingers beneath his chin. But my point in all this, Ms. Mackey, is that perhaps there has been a loss of meaning in translation, even just in an obscure text. A meaning that, if recovered, could help you get ahead of whatever Pascal is planning. Deliverance found herself nodding, excited at this new possibility. That sounds like a great idea. Thank you, Professor. He nodded and shared a fond look with Oliver. We will use our independent study time to gather and begin combing through translations of Revelation. Oliver will keep you updated on our progress, or so I assume? Oliver looked at Deliverance hopefully, and she grumbled about being put on the spot, but nodded anyway. Oliver was in this as much as she was. They would have to work out their differences, and fast. Oliver beamed, and Professor Hawthorne nodded. Students began filing into the classroom, and Deliverance stood, taking that as their cue to leave. Enjoy the rest of your Friday, and I'll be seeing you tomorrow during the trip to Hawthorne. I usually abstain, but I think it would be good to get out of the wards for a while. Same, Deliverance thought tiredly. Then a thought occurred to her. Hey, the town of Hawthorne is spelled like your last name, right? That must get confusing sometimes. The professor flashed a grin at her, giving another rare glimpse of his canines. Yes, the resemblance gets a bit confusing, but I couldn't give up the name. Even when my family raised Hawthorne into its early start, I decided not to lose my tie to the town. I still have family there, actually. Deliverance blinked, and she imagined a spiraling buffering symbol hovering over her head as she put two and two together. Wait, your family founded Hawthorne? How long ago was that exactly? Professor Hawthorne shook his head and chuckled softly. Long enough. And it's a bit of a faux pas to ask a vampire their age, but I am quite old, Ms. Mackey. Looks can be deceiving, especially with my kin. Deliverance blushed, unaware that she had stepped wrong, but the professor waved off her embarrassment. It's no problem. It happens all the time. Every semester, in fact. Now, my class will be beginning shortly, but Oliver, I will see you during our independent study at the end of the day. And I will see you both tomorrow morning. Deliverance and Oliver waved their goodbyes and slipped out of the classroom just as the bell rang. They both had a free period at this time of day, and they had been using it for some more intimate activities, but Deliverance didn't think they'd end up in bed today. Oliver, can you come back to my room with me? We need to talk. Deliverance said, her voice soft. Sure, Oliver replied uncertainly. What do you need to talk about? He asked, his brow furrowed in concern. Deliverance sighed and took Oliver's hand in hers as they walked back to her room. She had so much on her mind that she didn't think she'd have time to talk about it now. But there was something she wanted to say before they left for the day. I just want you to know that I trust you, and I believe in you, she said softly, squeezing his hand gently. You have no idea how much that means to me. Oliver smiled and returned the squeeze, understanding the gravity of her words. He knew this was not just about today or about him, it was about what Deliverance needed from him in order to move forward. Thank you, he said sincerely. I won't let you down. Deliverance nodded and hugged Oliver tightly. Chapter 9. Back in her room, Deliverance sat on the bed while Oliver hovered nervously by the doorway. She resisted the urge to roll her eyes. She had known Oliver was non-confrontational, but she thought she was entitled to some frustration. "Oliver," she said evenly, "can you come sit down? You're making me nervous by hovering like that, like you're going to bolt out the door or something." He choked out a laugh but complied, perching on the bed and still looking flighty. "If this is about Lexi." "Oh, so you were paying attention," she couldn't help but snap. She took a slow breath before continuing. "Look, I'm not asking you to fight my battles for me, and I know you have a history with Lexi, but you just sat there. You didn't even make eye contact with me. Talk about leaving me high and fucking dry." "I didn't know what to say," he admitted, and Deliverance felt her steely exterior start to crack. "I just needed some show of support. That you were on my side. I wasn't expecting some grand gesture, or for you to attack her as Jet did." She looked fondly at Jet, who zapped into his salamander form and strutted around her desk. Laughing, she tried to keep her smile on for Oliver. It only half worked. She nudged his knee with her own. "You get why I was upset, right?" He nodded miserably, then looked up at her with his beautiful copper eyes. "I'm sorry, Deliverance. I just froze, but you stood your ground. It was kind of amazing." She grinned. "It was, wasn't it?" He huffed a laugh, reaching out his hand to intertwine their fingers. "Lexi was right, you know. About me, I mean. I'm bookish, and I've never been brave. My familiar is a fire drake who hides in my laundry, and I'm exactly the same way. I hide from things. But you and Jet, you're powerhouses. I honestly don't know how you put up with me at all." Deliverance squeezed his hand. "There's nothing wrong with being bookish. Besides, you did better with the wards than I did this morning, so bookish can't be all that bad." They sat in silence for a few minutes, and then Deliverance sighed. She couldn't stay mad at Oliver for very long. Scooting over so that they were more closely pressed together, she tilted her head to rest her cheek on his shoulder. "Well," she said softly, "we're going to Hawthorne tomorrow, and I guess we'll just have to steer clear of Lexi for a while. Her jab about Roman was a little too close to the mark, and I have no idea who her source was for finding out I'm a Class 5 super. That's something I'll definitely be looking into. I don't like people knowing my business." He turned to kiss the top of her head. "We'll figure it out." She liked the sound of "we" and smiled to herself. She whistled softly for Jet, and he zapped into his flying squirrel form to launch himself at them. Oliver used his long arms to catch Jet midair, and her familiar quickly scurried over to latch onto her wrist. She scratched between Jet's velvety ears, then sat up straight to meet Oliver's eyes. "We have one more class today, and then want to meet back here." It was an olive branch, an unspoken question to see if they were okay now. Oliver nodded and gave her a lopsided smile. He wrapped his arms around her and gave her a short kiss on the lips. There was no heat behind it, just a small reassurance that she hadn't realized she needed it. The heat would come later. They both gathered their backpacks up, Deliverance careful not to jostle Jet too much, and they left her room to head back to the classrooms. She thought their talk had gone well, and was relieved to be back on the comfortable ground with Oliver. She had a sneaking suspicion that Lexi was only getting started with her harassment, so he would have to step up to the plate. Probably sooner rather than later. She glanced sideways at him, and resolved to be there for him if he needed her. With that thought, they continued on their way to the classrooms, Oliver's hand wrapped around hers, a silent reminder of what was to come. As they walked, Deliverance couldn't help but feel like something had shifted between them during their conversation. It was subtle, but it felt different, in a good way. She squeezed Oliver's hand and smiled up at him as they rounded the corner to their classrooms. They stopped just outside the door and looked into each other's eyes, both feeling that something new had blossomed between them. Deliverance remembered what Lexi had said about taking a chance, and she realized that this was her chance. Oliver tentatively leaned in, eyes never leaving Deliverance's, and kissed her gently on the cheek. She felt a warmth spread through her body, and knew that whatever had been between them before was nothing compared to what it had become. With a smile, Oliver finally let go of Deliverance's hand, and they both headed into their classrooms. Little did they know, this would be the beginning of something beautiful. The bell rang shortly after, and Deliverance walked out with a newfound hope in her heart. She felt lighter, as if the weight of uncertainty had been lifted off her shoulders. Chapter 10. Saturday morning, Deliverance sat on the steps in front of the school, her knees bouncing nervously. She had told Oliver she needed some fresh air, and to meet her outside when the buses to Hawthorne got there. Roman found her first, and took up a position nearby. She sat for a few minutes, her nerves still jangling, and she finally decided she needed company to distract her from her anxiety. She waved Roman over, and he came closer, sitting on the step a few feet away. "Yes, Deliverance?" His deadpan expression did little to help calm raging anxiety. If anything, it helped to speed its inner growth to an almost dizzying degree of discomfort. "Wow, just what I need, more stress," she thought. "Somehow, Lexi found out that I'm a Class 5 super, and that you're my chaperone, and she told everyone, and I have no idea how she found out," Deliverance blurted in one breath. Roman furrowed his eyebrows. "I did not tell anyone, and my fellow guardians are not supposed to talk of assignments with anyone outside our ranks." "Well, someone must have," Deliverance muttered. She sighed, "Never mind. I just can't shake her out of my head. She's like an annoying blonde mosquito or something. I can inquire into the matter if you'd like." "No, that's okay. I'll just have to get used to everyone treating me like a bomb. Besides, it's not like I can take the information away from them now. They already have it for better or for worse." Roman nodded. "That is true, but I will still try to find out how the information was released. Discreetly, of course." Deliverance went back to wringing her hands in her lap, and smiled without looking up. "Thanks, Roman." She looked up and groaned when she saw Lexi approaching. She so did not need this right now. "I see you've already got your babysitter for the day," Lexi said, smirking. "Why are you so invested in my business, Lexi? Do you have a crush on me or something?" "Because the feeling isn't mutual. Sorry for the letdown." Lexi frowned and narrowed her eyes at the jab. Before she could say anything else, Deliverance saw Oliver walking their way. He saw Lexi and hesitated, but then seemed to steel his resolve and met Deliverance on the stairs. "Hi, Deliverance," he said, giving her a quick peck on the cheek. "Lexi, can we help you?" Deliverance felt a pleasant heat warm her face. Oliver's show of support was a welcome change compared to the day before. "I was just telling Deliverance that she was leaving," Deliverance interrupted. "I told her I was already seeing someone, and she was a bit upset about it." "I was not." "Goodbye, Lexi," Deliverance said, taking Oliver's hand in hers. "Try not to pine after me too much. It makes you look desperate." Lexi's face turned an angry red. Then she huffed and stalked away, back to her group of friends. "What a bitch," Deliverance muttered, then she turned to Oliver, who looked at her and grinned. "You're cute when you do that." Deliverance laughed. "Do what?" "Put people in their place." He smiled and leaned down to kiss her. Deliverance chanced a look at Roman, who nodded in agreement. He then looked up, and she followed his gaze. The buses had arrived. Perfect timing. They all stood and joined the group of people, filing toward the buses. She let a grin spread across her face, knowing she would get some time outside of the claustrophobic wards. She breathed a sigh of relief, then led the way onto the bus. Once they were all settled, the bus driver drove off for their adventure. Deliverance stared out the window, watching as the trees flew past. She had a feeling that this was going to be her best day yet. As soon as she thought it, Oliver squeezed her hand in agreement, and Roman smiled from his seat in front of them. She knew that this day was going to be one for the books. The bus ride seemed to last an eternity, but soon enough they arrived at their destination. The group of teens stepped off of the bus and were met with a beautiful sight: acres upon acres of sprawling fields with gorgeous trees and winding paths leading them around each corner. Chapter 11. The trip into Hawthorne was uneventful, but passed too quickly. They had gotten a quick tour of the oldest buildings by Professor Hawthorne, who had told them of their original state, compared to the additions added over the decades since. Deliverance had enjoyed listening to the town's history, and Oliver had held her hand the entire time. Lexi had tried to throw in a few quick jabs whenever their groups came near each other, but Deliverance had shaken off each one fairly easily. She was hoping Lexi would get bored and leave her alone, but it would probably take a while. Back at the academy, Oliver went back to his room to shower and spend some time with Tasha. Deliverance took the time to shower as well, with Jet zapped into his salamander form to enjoy the steam. She dressed in comfy clothes and sat on her bed, towel drying her hair. She wondered when Oliver would stop by and what they would do, and she looked forward to some more physical contact to help soothe her frayed nerves. Jet zapped into his Finch form and fluttered around the room, looking agitated. Deliverance frowned at him. "Jet, what's up, buddy? Come here." He complied but zapped into his mouse form and began pacing circles around her bed. Something was obviously bothering him, but she had no idea what it was. On high alert, Deliverance scanned her room. The steam from her recent shower still hung thick in the air, but maybe a little too thick. As she watched, she saw eddies of gray vapor swirling through the air. She sniffed quickly but detected no smell of wood smoke. Her blood ran cold when she recognized the smoke for what it was. Koi had first appeared to her in a column of gray smoke. Upon her realization, the smoke thickened into a column, a shape slowly forming within it. Deliverance stood, but she had nowhere to go. Besides, Koi would undoubtedly just follow her if she tried to leave. She may as well face him and see what kind of omen he was burdening her with this time. Koi stepped forward and the column dissolved, lingering by his feet. He was dressed in a stuffy-looking suit, and had his hands clasped behind his back. Deliverance was not impressed, and put her hands on her hips. "You look like an accountant. A very boring accountant." She leveled a glare at him. "What do you want?" He tutted. "Now, Deliverance, where are your manners? Surely you haven't lost them in the short time I've been away." "My manners are reserved for people deserving of my time. Now what do you want?" "I just wanted to check in on you, see if you're still fighting the good fight or whatever it is you believe you're doing." He smiled at her, sickly sweet. Annoyed, Deliverance did not return the smile. "Well, thanks for checking in, but believe it or not, I don't have time to entertain you today. So, you can fuck right off to wherever it is you spend your time, lurking and being creepy." Koi frowned. "You're being very rude." "Thanks for noticing, I worked really hard on it." "Fine," he huffed delicately. "I'll be on my way, but I'll see you soon, Deliverance. Remember, there's nowhere I can't find you." With one last smile, the gray smoke at his feet whirled into life and enveloped his body, whisking him away and then dissolving back into nothingness. Deliverance sank into her bed, shaking now that she didn't have to maintain her bravado anymore. She hadn't considered that Koi could find her anywhere she went, and it unnerved her more than she wanted to admit. She wasn't safe in her room or anywhere else at the academy, no matter how many wards there were. Jet squeaked from her pocket, and she scooped him out so that he could zap into his flying squirrel form and latch onto her wrist. "Thanks, Jet," she said softly, scratching his head while his tail lashed back and forth nervously. There was a knock on the door that startled Deliverance, and it took her a few heart-pounding moments to realize that it was probably Oliver. Still, she approached the door cautiously and only opened it a crack before confirming it was Oliver and swinging it wide to let him inside. Oliver immediately seemed to pick up on her tension, and he frowned. "Hey, what's wrong?" Deliverance shook her head and sighed. "Koi was just here." "Wait, Koi, as in the guy with the horseman?" "Here." "Yep." Oliver glanced nervously around the room, and Deliverance tiredly moved to sit on her bed, flopping onto her back. She spoke to the ceiling. "He's gone now, don't worry." She heard Oliver's footsteps approaching, and then he laid next to her, one arm across her stomach to pull them closer together. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Deliverance sighed. "As okay as I can be, I guess. Can we just lay here for a while?" Between Lexi being annoying and Coy being annoying, and the long day in town, my nerves are totally shot. Of course. Come here. Deliverance scooted over so that they could spoon, and Jet released her wrist so that he could curl up against her hair. They laid like that for a long time, silently just being there with each other. Gradually, Deliverance's body relaxed into Oliver, and she was able to lace their fingers together. She yawned, and Oliver huffed a laugh. Want me to leave so that you can get some rest? She considered his offer, but decided to counter. She asked softly, I'm really tired and I'll probably fall asleep for a bit, but can you stay? Just for a little while? Oliver answered by squeezing her hand and snuggling closer to her. She sighed contentedly, and let herself enjoy the warmth and weight of him behind her. In no time at all, she was fast asleep. Chapter 12. On Monday, Deliverance got to Renov's class 3 minutes late, earning her a disapproving glance from the professor and a worried one from Oliver. She had worked with Roman on self-defense that morning, then accidentally took a much longer shower than she intended to try, working the many knots in her muscles loose. She had hastily thrown on her uniform and then raced to class, but she hadn't quite made it on time. Deliverance ducked her head and made her way to her seat in the back, but she was too distracted to notice Lexi's leg when it shot out into the aisle. It caught her at her shins and she sprawled forward, barely catching herself on her forearms. Her tired muscles barked with pain and protest, but Deliverance gritted her teeth and pushed to her feet despite it. Lexi snickered, but Deliverance decided not to give her any more attention and hurried to her seat instead. She sank into her chair and busied herself with taking out her notebook and pen, willing the burning in her face to recede. Renov was back to her lecture, but Deliverance could just stare at her notebook, still recovering from her unexpected fall. While she waited for the spike of adrenaline to run its course, she felt the tingling of sparks at her fingertips. She clenched her hands into fists and tried to slow her breathing. She heard her name mentioned and zoned her attention back into the classroom. It was Lexi. Of course it was fucking Lexi. I just don't think it's fair, Lexi was saying. Deliverance is a class 5 super, and I just feel like her magic is too dangerous for us more stable witches. I feel uncomfortable being in the same class as her. Multiple sets of eyes swiveled to meet hers, and Deliverance blanched. She chose to look at Renov instead, who glanced at Deliverance quickly, but turned back to Lexi with a disapproving frown. Ms. Mitchell, it is none of your business what class Deliverance is in, and if you're so concerned, then maybe you should be putting more effort into your own magic. The class tittered with laughter, but it seemed to bolster Lexi. She turned in her chair to meet Deliverance's gaze directly and smirked, tossing her blonde hair over one shoulder. My magic is stable, hers is not. She needs a chaperone outside the wards, but why doesn't she have one within the wards as well? Don't you think that would be the smartest, safest thing to do, Professor? The sparks in Deliverance's fingertips grew hotter, dancing up to her wrists now, and she tried to hide them under the table. She was used to the effort of subduing her magic, but her recent stress levels and physical fatigue made it difficult to concentrate. Why did Lexi pick today of all days to fuck with her like this? Deliverance had to close her eyes to concentrate, trying to ignore Lexi's ramping tirade so that she could keep her magic under control. She felt Jet move from her pocket to her wrist, where he usually went to comfort her, but she was too far gone for it to help. She felt like she was going to explode, and panted with the effort of fighting the sparks in her hands. They climbed higher up her forearms, and soon they were cresting over her elbows and visible above the desk. A wave of muttered concern swept through the classroom, and Deliverance cracked an eye open to meet Lexi's stare. Even she looked afraid of Deliverance's magic, truly afraid, and the petty rush of satisfaction broke her concentration. The sparks flooded up to her chest, and when she looked down, she saw bright threads of her magic zapping between the sparks, making it look like she was covered in electricity. Deliverance looked up again, lost in the heady rush of her magic, and all she knew was that she wanted to make Lexi pay for her cruel remarks, wanted her to regret pushing Deliverance so that she would never fuck with her again. In a trance, Deliverance felt her hands moving into her spherical power position, and Renov shouted for her to stop, but it was too late. Deliverance flung her hands at Lexi, and a ball of crackling magic hit her square in the chest and sent her flying. Chapter 13. A bolt of orange approached Deliverance, warding magic, and a cage of fiery threads worked their way around her. They shocked her back to herself, and she followed the source to see Professor Renove with her arms outstretched. The implications of what she had done hit her full force, and her magic receded, the sparks disappearing quickly and completely now that they had found a short release. Renove's ward dropped, and the entire class sat in a heavy, stunned silence. Deliverance scanned the room, dismayed at the fear written so clearly on every student's face. When she got to Oliver next to her, she found the same look, and he was leaning far back from her. There was a sharp stab of betrayal, made more jarring by her heightened emotions, and she felt the beginnings of tears begin to prick at her eyes. Deliverance shoved her things into her backpack and bolted from the room. All the students she passed leaned away from her, and even Lexi flinched away from where she was still sprawled against the wall. Deliverance made it out the door, and then she was running, tears flowing freely down her face. Jet stayed clamped onto her wrist, his little nails digging into the skin of her arm to keep from being jostled loose, and Deliverance ran across campus back to her room. After Koi's visit, it was no longer a true safe haven for her, but it was the closest one she had. She just needed to be elsewhere, away from the scared eyes and flinching bodies. She needed to be alone. Why couldn't everyone just leave her alone? Back in her room, Deliverance dropped her backpack by her desk, grabbed her pillow, and screamed as loud as she could into it. Then she sank onto her bed and clutched the pillow to her chest. What was she doing? Maybe Lexi was right, and her magic was dangerous. Hadn't her outburst in class proved as much? She remembered how it felt to send the surge of power straight at Lexi, her magic finally given form, how powerful and free she had felt. Jet released his grip on her wrist and bounded around her bed, zapping between his forms and clearly agitated. Tears that had stopped began to flow freely again, and she covered her face in her hands. She felt so conflicted, torn between wanting to keep her magic from hurting anyone else and letting it be as wild as it wanted to be. She thought she would be split in half with the force of it all. A strangled sound came from Jet, startling her out of her thoughts and making her look up to check on her familiar. She blinked a few times, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Jet made the sound again, hopping around her bed and sounding generally distressed. It was his finch form, but were those mouse ears? And a tail? She scooped him up, studying him worriedly, and he let out a half-squeak, half-chirp sound, pacing inside her hands and stumbling in his strange new form. "Calm down, buddy," she said soothingly. Jet quieted but remained pacing, his little tail lashing back and forth and throwing off his balance. Deliverance waited for him to calm down so that he could zap back into one of his normal forms, but he remained in his mixed form. He looked up at her, his black bird eyes blinking rapidly. He looked as confused and panicked as she felt. She took a few deep and slow breaths, willing herself to calm down. Of course, her familiar would be responding to her stress levels, but now they were just both even more stressed. Jet stopped pacing and nudged at her thumbs, warbling his strange new voice at her. "Fix this," he seemed to be saying, and it broke her heart that she didn't know how. Deliverance petted Jet's feathers and stroked his bizarre mouse ears. She had been surprised by Koi, attacked another student, scared the shit out of her classmates, and now her changeling familiar was stuck in between forms. All in the same day. God, I'm tired, she thought miserably. What the fuck are we supposed to do now? Chapter 14. Deliverance walked quickly across campus, heading for Renove's classroom. She knew the professor didn't have a class at this hour, and she wanted privacy so that she could apologize. There would probably be hell to pay for losing control. Maybe Lexi would get her wish, and Deliverance would have to be chaperoned 24 hours a day, but she liked Renove enough that she wanted to give her a formal apology. And thank her for bringing her down with the warding spell. She walked into the classroom and looked around, but Renove wasn't there. Instead, Oliver was. He looked up and his eyes widened in fear. Deliverance felt like she had been slapped and stayed in the doorway. "Deliverance," he said, "are you?" "Not now, Oliver." Okay? Just not now. But do you know where Renove is? She asked him, her tone harsh. Oliver flinched away from her, and Deliverance felt a spike of anger. Renove wasn't here to protect him if she got out of control, but this fight would be fought with words, not magic. Okay, fine, she snapped. You want to talk now? No, I'm not fine. Of course I'm not fucking fine. What prompted you to ask such an idiotic question, huh? She was met with stunned silence, so she continued. Are you afraid of me now? Is that it? Are you going to flinch away from me every time I see you? I didn't know what to do. You did nothing, Deliverance yelled. First, Lexi starts harassing me and you won't even look at me. Then she trips me and you said nothing. Then I lost control of my magic, and you still did nothing. When are you going to start doing something, Oliver? Anything? His voice was small. I was scared. Yeah, well, so was I, but I don't have the luxury of running away from it. So run, Oliver. Be a coward and run from me. It's not that I want to run. Look, either help me, Deliverance hissed, her tone dangerously low, or get the hell out of my way. Oliver stared at her, fear shining painfully obvious in his copper eyes. Deliverance turned for the door. If you see Professor Renove, tell her I'm in one of the practicum chambers looking for her. Or don't, I don't give a fuck what you do. She stormed out the door, and went into the practicum chamber immediately next to the classroom. She let the door close behind her, and slumped into a chair at the table, crossing her arms and resting her forehead against them. Jet warbled at her from her pocket, and she helped him onto the table surface. He wobbled a bit, and ended up leaning against her arm to help him perch straighter. His ears twitched uncomfortably, and he warbled softly again. The door to the chamber opened, and Deliverance whirled around, ready to tell Oliver to fuck off, but Renove was in the doorway instead. She sagged in relief. Hi, Professor. Hello, Ms. Mackey. Oliver said, you wanted to see me. Are you all right? Deliverance shook her head, tears springing to her eyes again. Her face was already red and puffy from crying. It's not like more crying would make it any worse. Professor Renove joined her at the table, resting her hands on its surface and looking at Deliverance with concern. They sat in silence for a while, Deliverance's tears slowly drying up. She breathed a shaky sigh and then gestured toward Jet. He's stuck, Deliverance said softly, and I don't know how to help him. I don't know how to fix any of this. Professor Renove gave her a gentle, understanding smile. It's all right, she said soothingly. We will figure out how to help him together. She squeezed Deliverance's shoulder comfortingly. Determination and hope blossomed in Deliverance's chest. She nodded firmly and turned back to Jet, determined to find a way to save him. She had no idea what that way would be, but she knew Professor Renove was right, they would figure it out together. They spent the next hour discussing options and possibilities, but eventually, they ran out of ideas. Deliverance's shoulders slumped in despair, as she realized there was nothing more they could do for Jet. Chapter 15. Renove held out a hand toward Jet. May I? Deliverance nudged Jet toward her, and he stumbled across the table, warbling softly. Renove's eyes widened, but she still let him come to her and she gingerly stroked his feathers. A chimera, Renove said quietly, then cleared her throat and spoke louder. Jet is a changeling, which means he has many discrete and separate forms. A chimera is a mixed being that has traits of many forms within one. The mythical manticore is an example of one such form. Is he stuck forever? Can we fix it? Deliverance whispered, voicing her fear. Jet warbled miserably, and her heart ached to see him so distressed. Professor Renove shook her head thoughtfully. I don't believe so, no. Our familiars react to our emotions. That's part of what makes the bond between witch and familiar so unique and resilient. If you can calm yourself, then I believe Jet will be able to return to a single form. Deliverance sagged in relief, and Jet's answering warble sounded less distressed. Deliverance, Renov said gently. Jet isn't the only thing that needs fixing. Deliverance nodded. I know, Professor. I'm sorry for what I did in class this morning. I truly am. I actually came here to thank you for bringing me down. I just got lost in my magic and, well, you saw what happened. That's why I've been suppressing it. I've been worried that something like this would happen. Do you remember my lesson last week? Renov asked, the one about the mechanics of magic? Deliverance tried to think back. You said that magic is inherent to us, that it's a living thing. Exactly. What I failed to mention is that magic, no matter the class of super, needs room to breathe. It is a living thing and therefore grows with us. I believe that your magic is suffocating, which is why you have been so stressed and why your reaction in class this morning was so strong. It finally was given air to breathe and expanded as wide as it could, overtaking you completely. Deliverance hung her head. So I really am a volatile witch, like Lexi said. I'm dangerous. You're untrained, not destined to always be dangerous. If you regularly exercise your magic, let it breathe and give it room to stretch, then it won't be as volatile as it currently is. You can control your magic, Ms. Mackey. And I'm going to help you do just that. Deliverance looked up at her, daring to hope that the professor might be right. You will? Even after what I did. Renov smiled. Especially after what you did. You need help, and I am in the position to give you that help. However, I do believe it would be best to have our work be in more of an independent study format. Unless you want to return to the 101 class with your peers. Deliverance blanched and Renov quickly waved her off. That's what I thought, an independent study will be no problem at all. Deliverance breathed a sigh of relief. Thank you, Professor. Now about Jet. Renov studied her familiar thoughtfully. Reaching out, she gently rubbed his little ears. He warbled in response, head-butting her fingers and making her smile. My recommendation would be to think long and hard about the relationship you wish to have with your magic. Right now, you are fighting it and vice versa, but an agreement must be struck in order for your conflict to lessen. Once you have a more confident and stable relationship, then I believe Jet's conflict of form will resolve itself. Deliverance nodded, reaching out for Jet to wobble back over to her. She scooped him up and helped him back into her blazer's pocket. I'll try to do that, Professor. Thank you. Renov nodded once, then folded her hands on the table again. I believe it would be best if you took the rest of the day off from classes. Go back to your room, try to relax and consider what I've said. Your magic is a part of you. Accept yourself for who you are, and then, beginning tomorrow, we will work together and begin a new training regimen. Deal? Deliverance smiled at Professor Renov and nodded. Deal. Chapter 16. Back in her room, Deliverance helped Jet out of her pocket and helped him prop himself up against a textbook on her desk. She sat in the chair and leaned forward to rest on her arms. I feel bad for getting you stuck in this form, she admitted. Jet warbled at her and tottered over to headbutt her arm. She absently stroked his feathers while she considered Renov's advice. How was she supposed to accept her magic when it was so thoroughly fucking up her life? On a whim, or maybe it was intuition, she turned off her desk lamp so that the room fell into darkness. Deliverance closed her eyes and visualized her magic as a tangible thing. She remembered the white electric crackle of it dancing across her skin, and so she used that image to adjust her concept. With her eyes still closed, she held her hands in their spherical power position and willed her magic to come to her. Light, she thought. I need light from you. It wasn't a formal summoning spell, but it felt right to ask her magic for something rather than twisting it into a shape it clearly was resisting. She repeated her request for light like a mantra, and soon she felt the familiar sparks dancing across her fingers. Rather than flinching away, she forced her hands to relax and continued to focus on her need for light. A faint glow came through her closed eyelids, and she dared to open her eyes. Inside her hands was a glowing ball of light. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, giving a gentle nudge to her magic. More, please. She expanded her hands and watched the light grow to fit the space. It wasn't crackling and volatile like it had been in the classroom, but rather a calm pulsing of light held gently in her grasp. As Deliverance forced herself to further relax, her magic smoothed out and became a steady beacon of seamless light. She laughed at her success, and she saw what looked like bubbles of light dancing around the edges of her sphere like the effervescence of champagne. Seeing how attuned her magic was to her emotions, Deliverance finally understood why it had been manifesting as such a destructive force. The fear she had held for her magic made it even scarier, a vicious cycle that had made her spin out of control. Now, relaxing into a familiarity, her magic was calm and peaceful and beautiful. It finally felt right. Maybe she wasn't a hopeless blood witch at all. The magic singing through her veins was a comfort, like a friend returning after a long period of separation, and she felt joy. Her magic was a part of her, and she was a part of it. One could not exist without the other. With a sigh of relief, she let her hands return to her chest, closing them and letting her magic recede until it dissipated. Thank you, she thought soberly. I'm sorry for treating you so poorly, I'll try to do better. Deliverance reached for her desk lamp, but before she could reach it, she heard a yelped warble from Jet and then saw his trademark pop of sparks. She quickly turned on the light and found a solid black cat swaying on its paws. Jet? Deliverance whooped and held out her arms, and Jet jumped into them, purring loudly. She lifted him up, examining his new form, and a burst of laughter escaped her throat when she found him to be a cat through and through. Jet rubbed up against her, flicking her nose with his tail, and kept purring happily. Her familiar was no longer a chimera, he had gotten a new form, and Deliverance had finally gained a tentative trust with her magic. How many forms is that now, Jet? Deliverance asked her familiar. Jet leapt onto the bed and turned back to face her. He gave her a moreau and Deliverance laughed, holding up a finger. Okay, so we've got your new cat form, that's one. A pop of sparks and Jet was in his finch form, so Deliverance held up another finger. That's two. Another pop of sparks turned Jet into his salamander form, so she put up a third finger. Before she could say anything, Jet had zapped into his flying squirrel form. She grinned and adjusted her count. That's four. What are we missing, mouse form? The next pop of sparks brought Jet back to his cat form, and Deliverance frowned. Was he getting stuck again? She waited for Jet to zap himself into his mouse form, but instead he just jumped off the bed and began winding through her legs, arching his back to rub against her shins. Ha, Deliverance said to him. I guess you only have 4 forms at a time. I know the mouse form was one of your favorites, buddy, but maybe you'll like being a cat even more. Jet purred and leapt onto her lap so that she could cuddle him. She held Jet tight to her chest and kissed him between his cat ears. Her familiar was growing with her, and while her magic may still be new and untrained, they were on the same side now. Deliverance finally felt like a true blood witch, and like she had a fighting chance against Pascal. Against the entire world, if it came to that. She grinned and petted Jet's shiny black fur. Now the fun could begin. Chapter 17. Deliverance gripped the straps of her backpack nervously as she made her way to the library, Jet trotting at her heels. One of the upsides of Jet's new cat form is that he could keep up with her on his own instead of having to be carried. She kind of missed having his mouse form curled up in her pocket, but she was happy that her familiar was taking to being a cat so well. They were meeting Oliver at the library for a research session, and it would be the first time they had been alone together in a few days. She was worried about how they would be around each other now, if it would be weird or if they would go back to being comfortable around each other. As she held the door open so that Jet could pad inside before her, she hoped for the latter. She wound her way through the stacks and saw Oliver already at their table. She gulped but made herself stand straight as she approached. Oliver looked up and gave her a shy smile that made her heart melt a bit. He looked at her pocket and scanned her shoulders and wrists, probably searching for Jet, which is why he was unprepared for the black cat that jumped neatly onto the table and sat squarely in the middle of his scattered notes. Oliver squeaked in surprise, and the sound was so ridiculous that Deliverance had to laugh. He looked between Deliverance and her familiar, his eyes wide. "Is that Jet?" he asked incredulously, tentatively reaching out a hand. Jet immediately headbutted Oliver's hand and began purring loudly. Oliver began stroking along Jet's spine almost mechanically while he processed her familiar's new form, and he looked up at Deliverance in awe. "Wow," Oliver said, huffing a soft laugh, "a new form. That's amazing." She grinned. It really was amazing, and she was glad that Oliver was putting aside any differences they still had to work through to marvel at Jet's growth. They both smiled and watched Jet exploring the desk and batting at Oliver's papers. He looked up at Deliverance and meowed pointedly before dropping to the ground gracefully, making her roll her eyes. Deliverance sank into the chair beside Oliver and let her backpack rest against the table leg while she pulled out her notebook. "So, did you and Professor Hawthorne find anything in Revelation?" Oliver shook his head and frowned. "Nothing yet, but we're still looking. Professor Hawthorne even said that he would reach out to some local religious centers to get some other opinions." Deliverance nodded. "That's a good idea. In the meantime, I guess we go back to what this version was called. King something? King James, and yeah, I already pulled a copy." "Okay, so we should start." "Deliverance," Oliver interrupted softly, "I'm really sorry about how I've been acting." Deliverance blushed. "We can talk about that later." "We need to." "Can it be now?" he asked, finally looking up to meet her eyes. "I miss what we had. How comfortable we were with each other. I miss hanging out with you and Jet and making you laugh, and I miss you. Can I try again? Please?" Deliverance looked into his copper eyes, and they seemed to glow in the light of the desk lamp. She didn't have to consider Oliver's behavior anymore. She knew that she missed him just as much, if not more. She wanted him back in her life, and she was willing to give him a second chance. She just hoped he'd use it well. "We can try again," Deliverance assured him, reaching out to take his hand. "There's still time for us." Oliver smiled, relieved. He'd been scared that he had lost her forever, and now he was suddenly filled with renewed hope. He squeezed Deliverance's hand as if to say thank you, before standing up and leaning over to kiss her tenderly on the cheek. "I won't let you down this time," he said, his voice firm and full of conviction. "I promise." Deliverance smiled, a warmth spreading throughout her body. She wasn't sure what the future held for them both, but one thing was certain, they had each other now. Nothing else mattered. "Let's make the best of this," she said, standing up and linking her arm through his. "We'll figure it out together." Oliver smiled and nodded, overwhelmed with happiness and gratitude. He would never forget the precious gift that Deliverance had given him, a second chance. He was determined to make the most of it. Chapter 18. Oliver laced his fingers together with her, tugging her gently so that she would lean close enough for them to kiss. It was gentle at first, simply saying, "I miss you, and I'm sorry." Deliverance deepened the kiss, and when her tongue flicked to meet his, he moaned against her mouth. Heat snaked down her spine, and she brought her hands up to cup his face. She carted her fingers through the hair at the back of his neck, holding him in place. She needed more, so she sat back and motioned Oliver to scoot his chair back to make room for her. He complied, and she straddled him, kissing him fiercely. She felt how hard Oliver already was beneath her, but she was in no hurry. Tilting his chin up, she kissed down his neck, making him gasp into her hair, and she bit softly at the sensitive skin, sucking just hard enough to leave a faint mark. She wanted him to remember this later, remember how purposefully she was choosing him. It was a dare to choose her back. Oliver's fingers gripped her hips, digging in through the fabric of her uniform skirt, and she responded by slowly rocking her hips into him. His hips bucked, but she refused to move, pinning him to his chair and reclaiming his mouth. She took hold of his dress shirt and pulled sharply, causing the buttons to snap off and scatter into the towers of shelves. Her hand splayed across the planes of his chest, and she scratched at his skin lightly with her nails. "Deliverance, please," Oliver panted. In response, She rocked her hips into him again, agonizingly slowly, covering his mouth with her hand so that his groan wouldn't travel beyond their own hearing. She slid off his lap and knelt before him, tracing his cock through the material of his uniform pants. It twitched, and she smiled up at him, drunk on knowing she could make him react this way. Slowly, giving him a chance to stop her, she unbuttoned his pants and dipped her fingers below the waistband of his boxers, pulling his cock free. She caressed its length, then leaned forward and flicked her tongue at the tip. Oliver's breath caught, and she braced herself between his legs with one hand gripping his calf and the other curling around the base of his cock. Leisurely, she used her tongue to trace a line from her hand back to the tip and sucked him into her mouth. She swirled her tongue around the head, then dipped forward until she felt pressure at the back of her throat. She lifted her head back up, letting the flat of her tongue drag against the length of him. Oliver was shaking beneath her touch, and he gently ran his fingers through her hair, gripping enough for her to feel it, but letting her set the pace. She stroked him a few times with her hand, sucking gently at the tip of his cock, then she dipped her head and opened her throat to fit all of him in her mouth. He gasped, and she gripped his calf tighter, beginning a slow rhythm with her mouth and hand. She dipped down, slid back up slowly, then circled him with her tongue before dipping again. Oliver began to shake, his grip on her hair tightening, and Deliverance knew he was close. She picked up her pace, keeping her lips firm against him and using her tongue to give him the friction he needed. With a shudder and a soft cry, Oliver released into her mouth, and she swallowed as he came, returning to a gentle rhythm with her hand to ease him through his aftershocks. She felt his muscles slacken, and so she carefully sucked at his cock to keep from making a mess, then sat back to meet his eyes. His hair was damp with sweat, but his eyes were smoldering and bored into her. She didn't flinch away, and he leaned forward to press a gentle kiss to her lips, stroking her hair. He leaned back, and Deliverance rested her elbows on his knees. She licked her lips and raised an eyebrow, making Oliver chuckle softly. "You've got something on your neck," she told him, grinning wickedly. Oliver lifted his hand to the mark she had left on his neck, and he rolled his eyes but was smiling. "And whose fault is that?" "Mine." "You're welcome." Chapter 19. Jet ran over, still in his cat form, and meowed at them. Deliverance stroked his spine, letting his tail slide through her fingers, and Oliver reached down to scratch Jet's chin. Her familiar purred, reveling in the attention, but then he froze in place. His ears twitched toward some sound they couldn't hear, and then Jet was urgently pushing against them, meowing softly. Deliverance had no idea what had gotten into him, but she trusted her familiar, and so she hurriedly returned to her seat, straightening her disheveled uniform and wishing Oliver hadn't made her hair quite so messed up. Voices began approaching them, one deep and male, the other scratchy but undeniably female. Oliver scrambled to button his shirt back up, and Deliverance reached to help him, her fingers fumbling with the tiny buttons. They pulled their chairs close to the desk, tried to make some sense of their notes, and both picked up their pens as the two people rounded the corner and chanced across their table. "Oliver," Professor Hawthorne said, "I was hoping I'd find the two of you," he faltered, his nostrils flaring slightly, and Deliverance tried not to melt in embarrassment as the vamp undeniable smelled the sex they had just had. "Here. Right anyway. I want to introduce you to an acquaintance who will be helping us with revelation. This is Sister Sophronia Newton," Deliverance said quietly, eyes fixed on the nun that had made her life hell for years before she had been brought to the academy. "Of the Sisters of the Temple of Mary Louis." The sister smiled with no warmth, her watery gray eyes meeting Deliverance's own black ones. "Deliverance," the sister said, her scratchy voice grating on her nerves already, "I'm surprised to see you again. Then again, with the trouble Professor Hawthorne has been explaining to me, it makes sense that you'd be in the middle of it." Oliver and Professor Hawthorne laughed good-naturedly, if not a bit awkward, but Deliverance knew better. The sister hadn't meant it as a joke. This was the sister who had inspired the idea that Deliverance would burst into flame if she touched a Bible. The sister who was convinced that Deliverance wasn't just a problem child, but possessed by a demon. Sister Sophronia Newton was the main reason why Deliverance spent so long being afraid of her powers and of herself. She gritted out a smile, but she and the sister both knew it was fake. "I wasn't expecting to see you again, sister," she said truthfully. "I figured our paths would cross again," Sister Sophronia Newton responded, clasping her hands in front of her, the perfect nun. "After all, the Lord works in mysterious ways." After Professor Hawthorne and Sister Sophronia Newton left them in the library, Deliverance and Oliver quickly gathered their things and retreated to Deliverance's room. Deliverance had been incredibly turned on, and hoping Oliver could return the favor she had given him before their unwelcome guests had crashed the party, but nuns have a way of killing the mood. Especially this particular nun. "So, you and the sister go back a ways, I'm guessing?" Oliver asked her as they flopped onto her bed. Deliverance snuggled into Oliver, letting him wrap his arms around her, and sighed. "The good sister believes that I've been possessed or something. She has ever since I first got dropped at the temple. I believe taken by the devil's wily coaxing, is how she described it." Oliver whistled. "That sounds like one hell of a warm welcome, no pun intended." Deliverance groaned but snuggled closer anyway. "That was terrible." "Yeah, I know. Sister Sophronia Newton is seriously old school, and I didn't fit with how she believed kids were supposed to behave. I'm sure it's no stretch of the imagination to guess I was a bit of a problem child." "You? Never." Deliverance laughed and playfully shoved at Oliver's chest. Oliver responded by pulling her closer and dropping a kiss on the top of her head. Jet hopped onto the bed to join them, still in his cat form, and paced in a circle on Oliver's chest before plopping down and promptly falling asleep. Deliverance found herself dozing lightly as well, listening to the steady beat of Oliver's heart. "Deliverance?" Oliver paused, just for a moment, but his hesitation perked her up. "What do you think the second seal is going to be? Do you think we have a chance at beating Pascal this time?" His voice was small, and Deliverance realized he was scared. Of course he was. It was the logical response to an impending apocalypse, but she hadn't really understood that their situation would be affecting Oliver just as strongly as it was affecting her. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "On either count. But we've got more resources this time, including some seriously badass professors who actually believe us, so I want to believe we at least have a fighting chance." Oliver hummed softly in response, and Deliverance burrowed in closer, careful to keep from jostling Jet. She considered Oliver's questions as she began to doze again, the passage about the second seal echoing inside her mind until sleep finally claimed her. "And when he had opened the second seal, I heard the second beast say, 'Come and see.' And there went out another horse that was red, and power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth, and that they should kill one another, and there was given unto him a great sword." Chapter 20. The next few days were a whirlwind of training and research. Deliverance ricocheted between her lessons with Roman and Professor Renove to her library sessions with Oliver, then back to her room to sleep before starting over again. Professor Hawthorne and Oliver still weren't having any luck with different translations of Revelation, but they kept at it. A steady rotation of religious leaders from an assortment of faiths passed through Professor Hawthorne's classroom, but Sister Sophronia Newton had yet to leave. Deliverance had accidentally crossed paths with her a number of times, and each encounter had been stilted and passive-aggressive. She had no intention of giving any ground, and so she hoped the sister's departure would be sooner rather than later. During a research session with Oliver, while Deliverance was considering pinning him to one of the many sturdy bookshelves around them, Oliver sat up straight from where he had been scrolling through his phone. "Red horse," he said, turning to look at Deliverance with wide eyes. Deliverance cocked her head and waited for him to finish his thought. There surely had to be more to a research breakthrough than red horse, especially since they had been turning the phrase over for the better part of a week. "The winery, olive branches. It all fits." Deliverance frowned. "Oliver, I can't read your mind. What are you talking about?" He tilted his phone to show her the website for the local Stallion Winery. She scanned their About page, finding nothing interesting, but then Oliver drew her attention to the banner at the top of the page. Their logo was a stylized red horse rearing above two mirrored olive branches. The gears in her mind kicked into overdrive as she mentally ran through the passage again. And there went out another horse that was red, and power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth. Olive branches, she yelled, clapping her hand over her mouth when she remembered that they were in the library. She continued in an excited whisper, "Olive branches are a symbol of peace that come from the earth." Oliver bobbed his head excitedly. Their logo is a red horse with olive branches, and their main courtyard has a statue with both. Deliverance looked at the phone again, scrolling down to the picture he had first shown her. Sure enough, there was a carved wooden statue of a horse that was stained a wine red, and she could just make out the olive branches carved into the base by its hooves. She jumped out of her chair and started shoving papers into her bag. Jet recognized her urgency and stood up to stretch from where he had been taking a catnap. "We need to go see the headmaster. Immediately." Headmaster Helms sat behind his massive desk, stirring a cup of tea and looking bored as usual. They were waiting for Professors Renove and Hawthorne to arrive, so that Deliverance and Oliver could explain what they had found, and Deliverance was practically vibrating. Jet had zapped into his finch form so that he could perch on her shoulder, and was hopping from foot to foot. They were wasting time. Pascal could have figured out this location already, and they might even be spinning their wheels. They needed to go verify that this was the second seal. They needed to be doing something, not drinking tea. The two professors burst through the door, and without waiting for the go-ahead from Helms, Deliverance launched into a hurried explanation of what she and Oliver had discovered. When she was done, Renove looked at the headmaster and nodded sharply. "I believe this is worth investigating. We can take my car." "It's too late to go now," Headmaster Helms said, pausing to sip from his mug, "and I will need to call the winery to get permission for your arrival. I will make the calls now, and you may go tomorrow." "Thank you, Hea." "Tomorrow?" Deliverance had to yell. "Why not today? It's barely afternoon. We could be there and back before dinner for fuck's sake." "Ms. Mackey, there are rules that must be followed. You can't just show up unannounced." "Fucking watch me, petty boy. If you are to expect cooperation." He raised an eyebrow at Deliverance. "Even if I were giving you a choice, which I most certainly am not, what would you do if you left now, hum? Show up at the gates of an exclusive winery and demand to see their prized wooden sculpture that's hundreds of years old? And would you simply strong-arm your way through their security measures when they said no?" He tutted, and Deliverance felt her face go red. She was sizing up his desk, trying to figure out if she could vault it or if she should just go around so that she could throttle him. A hand cupped her shoulder. It was Professor Renove, and she gave Deliverance an "I know what you're thinking and don't you dare" look. "Thank you, Headmaster. We will leave first thing in the morning. I'll make arrangements with Deliverance and Oliver while you make the calls. The students should stay here." Deliverance's mouth fell open, but before she could protest, Professor Renove stepped in front of her. "Respectfully, Headmaster, I believe it is imperative that Deliverance and Oliver accompany us to the site. They made the connection, and Deliverance is the only one who can see Coy or the horsemen if they should make an appearance. I will coordinate with Roman so that he can join us as chaperone." Deliverance stared up at Renove in shock. She hadn't expected the professor to go to bat for them like that, and all she could do was swivel her attention back to the headmaster. He studied Professor Renove for a long time, and Renove stayed perfectly still while he did so. Finally he nodded and waved for them to leave. Chapter 21. Together, Professor Renove and Deliverance hurried left the office before Helms could change his mind, and were silent until they had made it outside. Deliverance breathed a sigh of relief, and then turned her attention to Professor Renove for their next move. Jet zapped back into his cat form, so that he could bat at a few dead leaves caught in a breeze. A reminder that the weather would be turning cold soon. Renove clapped her hands twice, as she always did before relaying information, and then motioned toward Professor Hawthorne first. "Professor, if you could get us a car set up, I'd like for you to drive tomorrow. As a vampire, I trust your reflexes on the road to get us to the winery and back both quickly and in one piece. Plus, an extra spellcaster wouldn't harm anything." They shared a smile, and Professor Hawthorne bowed slightly in acknowledgement of her praise. "I'll do that. See you all in the morning." He hurried off, leaving Professor Renove to address Deliverance and Oliver. "Deliverance, I'll secure Roman as a chaperone for our little field trip, and so the two of you should go back to your rooms and rest up. We've got a big day ahead of us. Make sure Jet comes with you, of course, and Oliver?" "Yes, Professor." Renove tapped a finger against her chin thoughtfully. "I know she isn't nearly ready now, but I would like you to consider defense training for both you and your familiar. Tasha, as a fire drake, would be a powerful ally against Pascal." Oliver began to protest, but she shook her head. "I'm only asking you to consider it. Now both of you run along. Meet me and Professor Hawthorne in front of the dorms at 7 a.m. Deliverance and Oliver both nodded, but before they left, Deliverance cleared her throat. "Professor? Thank you for sticking up for us with Helms." The professor sighed. "The headmaster is very particular where decorum is concerned. A stick in the mud, I believe you would call him. But he can be reasoned with, and I've had plenty of practice." She winked, and then flounced off back toward her classroom, leaving Deliverance and Oliver to begin their walk back to the dorms. She whistled softly for Jet, who abandoned his leaves and trotted happily after them. Oliver reached for her hand and laced their fingers together. "What are you thinking about our field trip?" Deliverance considered the question. What was she thinking? The shorter list would be what she wasn't thinking about. There were so many things to consider, so many potential dangers that she had been training for, plus the consideration that her training had really only just begun. Would Pascal be there? Would she have already been there? What if the seal was already broken, and tomorrow is when they would find out? What if, just what if? She sighed, squeezing Oliver's hand. "I'm thinking we need to get some food, and then get some sleep. But maybe we should work up an appetite first. Maybe in my room?" Oliver grinned. "You read my mind." The next morning their group left the school and drove in tense silence. Professor Hawthorne drove significantly faster than a human would have been able to pull off. Professor Renove sat solemnly in the passenger seat, and Deliverance was sandwiched between Oliver and Roman in the back seat, with Jet in cat form on her lap. Jet had quickly realized that he could coerce pets from Roman, and so was badgering him incessantly. Deliverance ended up pushing Jet into Roman's lap, so that he could get undivided attention, and so that she could lean into Oliver. After dinner the night before, they had turned in early, each in their own room so that they could spend some time alone with their familiars, and Deliverance had managed to get almost 10 hours of solid sleep before her alarm went off. She was nervous about what they would find at the Stallion Winery, but she let herself take some pleasure in being outside of the wards and in what she still considered normal clothes. She had begrudgingly gotten used to the uniforms, but being in jeans was better than being in a skirt in every single situation she could possibly imagine, including what she hoped was discovering the second seal, preferably before Pascal. "I have a question," Deliverance said, tired of sitting in such charged silence. "Yes, Deliverance?" Professor Renove asked. "Well, I always have Jet with me, obviously, but what are your familiars? And I guess where are they? I rarely see anyone else's, compared to Jet being with me all the time. I'm just curious." Professor Renove turned in her seat so that she could better see Deliverance in the back seat, her face settling into professor mode. Everyone has a different relationship with their familiar, as well as a comfort level with separation. Plus, the familiar's form often presents challenges, ones that your little changeling can circumvent. Jet meowed in acknowledgement, then kept purring as Roman massaged his cheeks. Deliverance considered what Renove had said. She couldn't imagine being separated from Jet for any length of time. Even Oliver saw Tasha at least daily. "Is it something we grow out of?" she asked, her voice quieter than she had intended. She didn't want her bond with Jet to change at all, and the idea that they could drift apart in any way made her incredibly uncomfortable. Jet picked up on her unease and moved back into her lap, headbutting her hand until she started automatically stroking his spine. "You and Jet will never lose what you have," Renov said, answering her unspoken question. "All relationships change, and maybe yours will as well, but it's not a requirement. When I first summoned Petter, he and I were inseparable. As my magic grew, he could be further from me in distance while still feeling like he was right next to me. It's how most witches tolerate extended absences from their familiars. They grow in their magic to allow for the distance." "What form does Petter have?" "He's a harpy eagle, and he's currently in the Academy Rookery with most of the other avian familiars. He's a bit of a mother hen, but don't ever tell him that, he'd be offended even though it's true." Deliverance smiled at the parallel. Renov was a bit of a mother hen herself. Chapter 22. "What about you, Professor Hawthorne?" Oliver asked, reaching out to scratch between Jet's ears. "I've never seen your familiar at all. Is she avian, like Professor Renov's familiar?" Professor Hawthorne chuckled to himself, looking at them in the rear-view mirror. Deliverance had a moment of concern, considering how fast they were currently driving, but his gaze quickly flicked back to the road, and she relaxed. "My Abigail is actually feline, a serval cat to be precise. She first came to me when we lived in Africa, and it's her favorite of all the places we visited, so it makes sense that her form would adapt to that region." Oliver tapped quickly into his phone to pull up a picture of a serval cat so that they both could see. Deliverance was struck by how beautiful the animal was, and was surprised she had never seen it around campus. It was a pretty hard creature to miss. "Does Abigail stay in your room with you?" "Oh no, she would absolutely hate it here." Professor Hawthorne laughed again, flashing his canine teeth. "Especially in winter. No, she's in Africa with some extended family. I miss her, but when I find time I go visit her there." "Africa?" Deliverance gaped at him. She couldn't imagine being that far away from her familiar, even only for a short while. "She's happiest there," he said simply, shrugging. "I'm happy if she's happy. Besides, as Professor Renov said, the stronger your magic, the further your familiar bond can comfortably stretch." Deliverance added insanely powerful magic to her growing list of reasons to never piss off a vampire. "Last but not least, what about you, Roman? What's your familiar like?" Roman sighed and smiled dreamily, a jarring combination compared to his usual stoicism. "Her name is Mia, and she's the best thing that ever happened to me." "She's canine?" Deliverance pictured the potential dog breeds that could belong to Big Bad Roman. Doberman? Wolfhound? Mastiff? A Cocker Spaniel? Deliverance blinked. "A Cocker Spaniel," she repeated. She silently nudged Oliver to ask him to pull up a picture. Maybe she was thinking of the wrong dog. Oliver complied and pulled up pictures of Cocker Spaniels. Curly-haired, floppy-eared, pint-sized little dogs, just as Deliverance had remembered. She leaned back against her seat. "Huh. Mia. Okay. Can I meet her when we get back to campus?" Roman grinned and nodded. She loves meeting new people. Deliverance laughed and shook her head, still processing that Roman's familiar was a Cocker Spaniel when Professor Hawthorne spoke from the front seat. "We're almost at the vineyard gate." The Stallion Winery sat in the center of a massive vineyard, and their group got to see some of it as Professor Hawthorne drove along the rolling curves of the winery road. Soon enough, a sprawling building came into view that Deliverance assumed was the winery. It was all polished wood and soaring ceilings, and she guessed that there was a basement just as large beneath the structure. Or cellar, she supposed they would call it. Professor Hawthorne parked, and their group got out of the car. A harried-looking wisp of a woman hurried to intercept them, pulling out her phone and typing even faster than Oliver. Hello, she said once she was done on her phone, focusing her attention on Professor Hawthorne. "Hello, Professor Renove answered, raising an eyebrow at the incorrect assumption that Professor Hawthorne was the informal leader of their group. The woman quickly adjusted her focus, nervously pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. Right. Hello, welcome to the Stallion. Your headmaster called and told us of your arrival. My understanding is that you wish to see our stallion sculpture? Renove nodded. That would be most kind of you, miss. Anita, she answered, giving them a tight smile. Just Anita, thank you. Right this way. She led them inside, and Deliverance suppressed a giggle. Either Anita was an incredibly anxious person, or Petty Boy had given her a bit of a scare on the phone. Maybe both? Hopefully both. Scared people were easy to persuade, and she felt better knowing they would have easy cooperation while they evaluated the sculpture. Anita opened a set of doors that deposited them in an inner courtyard, complete with fountains and meticulous landscaping. At the center, much larger than it had seemed in the picture, was the sculpture of the stallion. Deliverance knew it was the red horse of war. She could feel power thrumming in the air that surrounded it. Can you feel that? Oliver whispered. Deliverance nodded, and they all approached the sculpture. Renove thanked Anita and gently shooed her away so that they would have some privacy, and then she turned toward the rest of their group. What are we looking for, Ms. Mackey? Do you remember the passage? Before she could admit that she only remembered the gist of it, Professor Hawthorne began reciting from Revelation. And when he had opened the second seal, I heard the second beast say, Come and see. And there went out another horse that was red, and power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth, and that they should kill one another, and there was given unto him a great sword. Renove tapped her chin thoughtfully. I'm sure we all know how fond the Christian faith is of symbols, so I suggest we examine the sculpture for matching ones. We have the red horse, which leaves peace the earth, and a great sword, yes. They all nodded, and began their study of the sculpture and the base it stood upon. They fanned out, each studying a section of the ornate base, sifting through the tangle of carved symbols to try finding any that fit the verses. Deliverance's section had carved roses and vines, a bird's nest, a leaping fish. I think I found something, Roman called from the opposite side of the statue. The Stallion Winery sat in the center of a massive vineyard, and their group got to see some of it as Professor Hawthorne drove along the rolling curves of the winery road. Soon enough, a sprawling building came into view that Deliverance assumed was the winery. It was all polished wood and soaring ceilings, and she guessed that there was a basement just as large beneath the structure. Or cellar, she supposed they would call it. Professor Hawthorne parked, and their group got out of the car. A harried-looking wisp of a woman hurried to intercept them, pulling out her phone and typing even faster than Oliver. Hello, hello, she said once she was done on her phone, focusing her attention on Professor Hawthorne. Hello, Professor Renove answered, raising an eyebrow at the incorrect assumption that Professor Hawthorne was the informal leader of their group. The woman quickly adjusted her focus, nervously pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. Right. Hello, welcome to the Stallion. Your headmaster called and told us of your arrival. My understanding is that you wish to see our stallion sculpture? Renove nodded. That would be most kind of you, miss. Anita, she answered, giving them a tight smile. Just Anita, thank you. Right this way. Chapter 23. She led them inside, and Deliverance suppressed a giggle. Either Anita was an incredibly anxious person, or Petty Boy had given her a bit of a scare on the phone. Maybe both? Hopefully both. Scared people were easy to persuade, and she felt better knowing they would have easy cooperation while they evaluated the sculpture. Anita opened a set of doors that deposited them in an inner courtyard, complete with fountains and meticulous landscaping. At the center, much larger than it had seemed in the picture, was the sculpture of the stallion. Deliverance knew it was the red horse of war. She could feel power thrumming in the air that surrounded it. Can you feel that? Oliver whispered. Deliverance nodded, and they all approached the sculpture. Renove thanked Anita and gently shooed her away so that they would have some privacy, and then she turned toward the rest of their group. "What are we looking for, Ms. Mackey? Do you remember the passage?" Before she could admit that she only remembered the gist of it, Professor Hawthorne began reciting from Revelation. "And when he had opened the second seal, I heard the second beast say, 'Come and see.' And there went out another horse that was red, and power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth, and that they should kill one another, and there was given unto him a great sword." Renove tapped her chin thoughtfully. "I'm sure we all know how fond the Christian faith is of symbols, so I suggest we examine the sculpture for matching ones. We have the red horse, which leaves peace the earth, and a great sword, yes?" They all nodded, and began their study of the sculpture and the base it stood upon. They fanned out, each studying a section of the ornate base, sifting through the tangle of carved symbols to try finding any that fit the verses. Deliverance's section had carved roses and vines, a bird's nest, a leaping fish. "I think I found something," Roman called from the opposite side of the statue. Deliverance and everyone else hurried over, and found Roman pointing at a small piece of the carved base. It was the symbol of a book, with the hilt of a sword protruding from the pages. It didn't quite match the grain of the surrounding wood, which gave Deliverance pause. Everything else seemed to be carved of the same wood, so why would this be different? Unless... Jet padded over and placed a paw on the symbol, looking up at Deliverance and meowing. She knelt down, and he removed his paw so that she could reach out and place her hand in the same spot. "Here goes nothing," she thought. She pushed against the symbol. There was a soft click, then a sighing sound as the carved riot of roses beneath the symbol disengaged from the rest of the statue. With her little group looking on, Deliverance tugged lightly at the wood and revealed a drawer. Inside there was a silver sword with rubies set in the hilt, the great sword of war. "Fuck," Oliver whispered. "Language," Renove said automatically, but she sounded just as odd as Deliverance felt. They had found the second seal. And if the sword's presence was any indication, they had found it first. Deliverance didn't dare take the sword out, so she pushed the drawer closed and the carved wood slid back together with no evidence that it had ever moved. She looked up at Professor Renove, who caught her eye and nodded. "This must be the second seal. Professor Hawthorne, Roman and I will place wards on the seal, including a tampering spell. I will be made aware of any attempts to break through the wards, which should give us time to return here before they yield and face Pascal if she tries to break this seal. We will be ready this time." Deliverance and Oliver stepped back to give the professors and Roman room to work. It was amazing to witness the weaving of such powerful magic, and Deliverance felt her own magic singing in her blood, wishing to join itself to the other spells. She soothed her magic and held Oliver's hand instead. "Not today," she told it, "not yet." Once the wards were in place, they found Anita and thanked her for her time, then got back in the car and began their return drive to the academy. The car was quiet, but Deliverance didn't try to break the silence this time. They had found the second seal before Pascal, warded it with magic crafted by powerful spellcasters, and they would know when Pascal tried to break the wards. Everything was looking up, so why did Deliverance feel such a powerful sense of dread? Jet zapped into his flying squirrel form, his first break from being a cat in a while, and latched onto her wrist. She petted his soft fur, and let herself lean into Oliver. She wanted to dismiss her misgivings, but her intuition had gotten her out of scrapes in the past, and she wasn't about to start ignoring it now. When they got back to campus, she would visit a practicum chamber and see if she could borrow some of the protective crystals and herbs Renove had been teaching them about. Some extra precautions can't hurt. Chapter 24. When they got back to campus, Deliverance went with Oliver back to his room. They had been spending a lot of time in her room, and she wanted a change of pace. Oliver opened the door for her, and she headed toward the bed but saw Tasha, then stopped. "Oh wow. What? Tasha, she's..." Oliver hurried past her to check on his familiar, and stopped when he saw the bed. Tasha was lounging there, blinking lazily at them, but she had also almost doubled in size. Oliver crossed the room to the bed and took Tasha's diamond-shaped head in his hands, kissing her scaly forehead. "Hey sweetheart, look at you. You're growing." Tasha's tail thumped against the bed a few times, and she burrowed into Oliver's chest, a deep rumble in her throat marking her version of purring. Jet zapped into his cat form and hopped onto the bed to inspect his friend, and Tasha sniffed at his new form cautiously. Hay reached out a paw very carefully and booped Tasha on the nose. Tasha snorted softly, then lowered her head so that Jet could hop on. With both of their bigger forms, it was easy enough for Tasha to raise him higher off the bed, and Jet's tail lashed back and forth in excitement. Oliver returned to Deliverance and took her hand, and they both fondly watched their familiars playing together. "I can't believe how much she grew while I was away," Oliver said, his voice kind of sad. "We're all growing," Deliverance responded. "It's amazing to watch, but do you think it will be enough?" "What do you mean?" "I'm just thinking aloud. I guess I'm wondering if it'll all be too little, too late." She squeezed his hand and tilted her head to rest her cheek on his shoulder. "I'm excited we got to the seal first, and that it's been awarded and essentially booby-trapped, but something still feels wrong. I don't know how to explain it." Oliver turned so that he was facing her, tilting her chin up so that their eyes could meet. "You've always trusted your gut feelings before, right?" "Yeah." "Then we'll just have to trust this one. What do you want to do?" Deliverance felt a rush of warmth at his trust, and she pushed onto her tiptoes to kiss him gently. "Well, I was thinking we should at least get some herbs and crystals from one of the practicum chambers. Renov has been teaching us all of this defensive stuff, so we may as well use it." "Okay, then what?" "Then I don't know. Maybe I'll think of something tomorrow. I want to at least have tonight to feel good about the progress we've made." Oliver smiled. "Sounds good." He turned back to watch their familiars, where Jet was currently playing with Tasha's tail. "I can't believe how much Tasha grew just in one day. I'm kind of sorry I missed it, you know." Deliverance squeezed his hand. "Yeah, I know. I've been thinking, maybe I should start bringing Tasha with me more often instead of letting her hide in my room. Instead of always hiding myself." He hesitated, and Deliverance waited patiently for him to continue. "What Professor Renov said really stuck with me, about getting some physical defense training, and I think I'm going to try it. I'll try to convince Tasha to come too. I want to be able to keep Tasha safe. And you?" His copper eyes met hers, and Deliverance smiled up at him. "How about we both work to keep ourselves and each other safe? Together." He nodded and then laughed. "Besides, Tasha may not fit through the door for much longer if she has another growth spurt. We may have to address her size sooner rather than later." Tasha huffed, drawing their attention back to her. She snorted delicately, twin puffs of smoke drifting out of her nostrils, and they laughed. Oliver brought Deliverance over to the bed, and they both began stroking Tasha's scales. She started her rumbling purr up again, and Deliverance relaxed into the moment. If they could start training together, with both of their familiars, then she would feel a lot better about their chances in the fight against the apocalypse. She grinned at the thought of Tasha singeing Pascali's perfect blonde bob, and Oliver caught her smiling. "What?" "Oh, nothing," Deliverance said. "Just scheming. You're cute when you scheme." "I know." Chapter 25. Deliverance and Oliver decided to get dinner together, so they walked across campus with Jet carving circles through the air in his finch form. They held hands the whole way and enjoyed the cool night. A crisp breeze signaled the impending arrival of autumn, and Deliverance pictured the campus with all the leaves fiery and golden. Soon enough, there would be snow, softening all the edges and painting everything white. When they opened the doors to the dining hall, Jet back in cat form and leading the way, Deliverance's mouth watered at the smell of melted cheese and marinara sauce. "Please let it be lasagna," she thought to herself. They quickly moved through the line of students, and sure enough, she was able to snag a square of delicious-looking lasagna. They wound through tangles of students to reach their usual window table, and had just settled in when Deliverance caught a glimpse of blonde hair in her peripheral vision. Groaning, she was so not in the mood for another Lexi tantrum. "Hi, Oliver." "Deliverance." Lexi's voice was annoyingly chipper for the first half of her greeting, and purposefully flat for the second half. It was a cheap trick, and Deliverance was not impressed. "What do you want now, Lexi? And can you hurry? I'm trying to enjoy my food before it gets cold." "Oh, nothing really," Lexi said, tapping her annoyingly perfect nails against the surface of their table. "I just wanted to see how you were doing after your little episode in class. You haven't been back since, and I was curious as to why." Deliverance threw back her head and laughed. She had forgotten that the last time she had seen Lexi had been when her magic had exploded and thrown the bitch against a wall. She had grown to be on so much better terms with her magic that she had almost forgotten her outburst. Or, as Lexi had called it, episode. "Frankly, Lexi, it's none of your goddamn business what I do with my magic. I guess I should ask you though, how are you doing? My big, bad Class 5 magic didn't do any irreparable damage to you, did it? You look so scared. I hope I didn't frighten you too terribly." Deliverance made her eyes go round with fake concern, and Lexi frowned at her, obviously seeing through it. "I'm fine," she said primly. "And Oliver? How are you after Deliverance freaked out and almost fried the whole classroom? You hanging in there?" Oliver grinned at Lexi. "I'm great actually, happy as could be with Deliverance and her magic and my life in general. Thanks for asking." Deliverance smirked. Apparently, Oliver had jumped on board with the kill her with kindness approach, and she loved the feeling of being co-conspirators. Lexi looked confused but tried to recover. "Right. Well, Oliver, my offer still stands. Whenever you're done playing with your new toy, you're welcome to rejoin us, normal people. Ditch her sooner rather than later, okay?" Deliverance kept her smile plastered on, hiding that the jab had hit home. She wasn't normal, had never been normal, but Oliver liked that about her. It made them stronger, choosing each other and being honest about it. "Right? Lexi, I'm fine where I am. Now if you don't mind, Deliverance and I are trying to enjoy our food. Can you, I don't know, kindly fuck off?" Deliverance snorted and reached for her water. She couldn't have put it any better herself. Lexi huffed and dropped all pretenses, turning to Deliverance. "You're a freak, and everyone knows it. We're all getting tired of your special treatment, and just waiting for you to crash and burn right out of the academy. Enjoy it while it lasts." She stalked off, and Deliverance rolled her eyes, turning back to her food. She picked up her fork and stabbed at her lasagna, maybe a little too forcefully. "Don't let her get to you," I said quietly. "She's just jealous that she can't have what we do." Deliverance smiled and nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yeah, you're right. That girl needs to learn the power of choosing yourself and loving your own company before looking for it in someone else." She took a bite of the lasagna and smiled. "Besides, I'm happy here with you guys," she said, gesturing around the table at us all. She was right. We had something pretty special going on, despite what Lexi may have thought about it. I put my hand over hers in support, and we continued eating. Chapter 26. "You okay?" Oliver asked softly. Deliverance looked up to meet his copper eyes, concern written across his face. She smiled and nodded. "Just fine. You handled her well too, you know. I particularly enjoyed the part where you told her to fuck off." He laughed. "You know what? I enjoyed that part too." She smiled, and then finally got to eat her lasagna. It was still nice and hot, and it was cheesy and perfect and just as satisfying as she had hoped. Deliverance walked Oliver back to his room, and then returned to her own with Jet in tow. With Jet trotting beside her, she worried at the tiger's eye stone she had taken from the practicum chamber after their first magical defense lesson with Renove. She decided that the next morning, she would bring Oliver to a practicum chamber and have him help her evaluate some of the items there. He was the more bookish of the two of them, so maybe he would think of something she hadn't. She mentally reviewed the list of crystals and herbs that would be transportable, and how they could be used, and when she got to her door she let herself in quickly. She moved to her desk in the dark, and flicked on the lamp so that she could write some of her ideas down. "Hello, Deliverance." She yelped and whirled to face the voice, finding Koi creepily lurking by her closet. Jet arched his back and hissed at him, standing protectively by Deliverance's feet. She threw up her hands and let her bag drop by her desk, then pulled out her desk chair and sank into it. "Koi fucking hell, can't you at least warn me with your smoke thing like you've been doing? You're going to give me a heart attack if you make a habit of lurking in my room." Koi smiled and clasped his hands behind his back. "Well, a heart attack certainly won't do. You're much too fun to play with, and I need you alive for that. I'll try to do what was it? My smoke thing moving forward." "What do you want?" she snapped. "I wanted to see what you were doing, of course. The fate of your world does hang in the balance, or had that slipped your mind?" "Of course, silly me, how could I forget? Now get to the point of your visit if you don't mind." My, we're a bit touchy tonight. Is the weight of it all beginning to wear away at your resolve?" "Not even a little bit." "Pity." Deliverance leveled him with a glare. She considered her magic. It was still volatile and new to her, but she had managed to lay Lexi flat on her ass. Maybe she could attack Koi the same way? She needed to keep him talking while she figured it out. Which would be easy, considering how highly he apparently thought of himself. "What do you have to gain from all of this, Koi? If the world ends, what's that going to mean for you?" He tapped his chin with a finger, looking up at the ceiling. "It would be fun to watch for starters, and it would also simplify things. The world would need to be made anew, and I would be there to help shape it into something less messy and complicated. Your species has truly ruined this world, and the only true solution is to start from scratch. Does that answer your question?" Deliverance shook her head, forming her reply without thinking too much about it. "No, it doesn't. Why are you so invested in bringing out the apocalypse? What did we ever do to you, besides be messy and complicated or whatever?" Koi frowned at having his words thrown back at him. "Deliverance, I don't believe you understand much of anything at all. Are you even trying? Or do you simply not care?" "Of course I care." "Then you're saying it's pure ignorance?" He tutted, sounding annoyingly like Headmaster Helms when he was bored and disappointed. "The horsemen are entities in their own right, but I am simply a helping hand. I'm a demon, Deliverance, and my sole purpose is to cause mayhem and mischief. I quite enjoy my job, which makes me exceedingly good at it." Deliverance studied him. "You're a demon? So you don't have to look like a has-been accountant, and you chose to anyway?" Koi huffed. "What, would you rather I have horns and breath sulfurous fire? Please, not all of us enjoy being clichés." "Are you calling me a cliché? Was I not perfectly clear the first time?" "Fuck you, Koi. You and the horse you rode in on. Oh wait, you're not actually a horseman. You're just a fucking demon who's tagging along." She crossed her arms defiantly, refusing to let it sink in that she was exchanging banter with a literal demon, so that she didn't lose her nerve. Sister Sophronia Newton would have a field day with that knowledge. "Koi, why are you really here? In my room right now, just why?" Koi smiled. "Exactly what I said before. I'm checking in to see what you're doing. Compared to Pascal, you're doing remarkably little, which is surprising but remarkably interesting." Deliverance's blood ran cold. "What is Pascal doing? Where is she?" Koi shrugged. "I'm not all-knowing, Deliverance. The last I checked, she was on her way to the second seal. The winery, yes. She's on her way there now?" Deliverance demanded, reaching down to grab her backpack. She needed to get Oliver and find the professors. "Now." Koi shrugged again, smirking. "The last I checked, she was. Maybe you ought to hurry if you want to cross paths with her again. She's probably there by now." Deliverance yelled in frustration and shouldered her bag, bolting for the door. As she closed it, she saw Koi begin to dissolve into smoke, his laugh following her as she sprinted down the hallway with Jet hot on her heels. Chapter 27. Once she was outside, Jet zapped into his Finch form so that he could better keep up with her. She decided she couldn't waste time going to fetch Oliver, so she called him instead as she ran for the headmaster's office. He answered right away. "Deliverance? I was just thinking about you. Oliver. Pascal is on her way. To the second seal. Right now." "What?" His voice turned into an electronic screech from the volume, and Deliverance had to pull the phone away from her ear. She panted from the exertion of running and trying to talk on the phone at the same time, gathering her breath so that she could form full phrases. "Do you have Professor Hawthorne's number?" "Yeah, I." "Call him. Tell him to get Renove. We need a car. And we need to leave now." "Okay, I'll meet you out front." "Where are you now?" "Going to get Headmaster Helms." Oliver sounded frantic, but his voice was surprisingly steady. "Okay. Meet me in front of the dorms as soon as you can. I'll get the professors. Talk to you soon." The call ended, and Deliverance shoved her phone back in her jacket pocket. She skidded to a halt and yanked open the door to the building where Helms' office was located and hurried inside. Jet zoomed in behind her just as the doors were about to close and chirped as if to remind her not to leave him behind. He flew toward the ground and zapped into cat form midair, gracefully landing on his paws and following her lead. She breezed past his spluttering secretary and slapped her hands hard against the heavy door to throw them open. Headmaster Helms was sitting behind his desk and looked up at the intrusion, frowning when he saw Deliverance. "Ms. Mackey, you can't just..." "Pascal is on her way to the second seal. She may even be there by now. We need to go intercept her." "And how do you know this?" "Coy showed up in my room and told me." Helms regarded her carefully. "And you're sure he was telling the truth?" Deliverance paused. It hadn't occurred to her that Coy may have been lying to get her all worked up. She replayed the conversation in her mind and decided that no, he had been telling the truth. Between Coy's appearance and her intuition, she knew something terrible would happen tonight. "He was telling the truth," Deliverance said aloud. "Oliver is gathering the professors, and I came straight here to tell you. We need to go directly to the second seal tonight, if we want to stop her." Helms nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, I concur with your logic. I will alert Roman and have him meet you." Deliverance let out an exasperated sigh. "You're really worried about a chaperone right now?" The chaperone system for Class 5 magic users was implemented for a reason and is non-negotiable. "Ah, fine. So we can go?" "Yes, you may go." "Thanks, bye." She left without ceremony, passing the secretary again and ignoring her glare. She had bigger issues than being likable tonight. Back outside, she began her trip back across campus at a jog this time instead of at a sprint. Jet loped beside her in cat form, meowing to get her attention. She slowed to a stop and looked at her familiar. "What is it, buddy?" Jet flicked his ears and looked up at her with huge eyes. Deliverance realized that she had been so caught up in hurrying to get to Helms that she really did almost leave him behind. She knelt on the sidewalk and pulled Jet to her chest. "I wouldn't have left you, Jet. I'm sorry for doing that with the door. I'm just still used to carrying you in my pocket all the time. I wasn't thinking, I'm sorry." She leaned back so that she could see his face, and Jet met her eyes. He blinked at her and then meowed softly, headbutting her hand and purring. Deliverance breathed a sigh of relief. They were okay. She stood and looked down at Jet. "You ready? We're going to run, so maybe Finch form would be easier. It'll save your little cat paws for the real fight. Are you ready to face Pascal again? I'll let you help this time, I promise." Jet zapped into his Finch form and hopped a few times on the sidewalk ready to go. Deliverance smiled at her familiar, took a deep breath and started running. Her feet pounded on the pavement, her backpack thudding against her shoulders in a staccato rhythm, and Jet's solid black Finch form zipped through the air above her. They crossed campus quickly. When she turned the corner by the dorms, she saw Oliver, Professor Hawthorne, and Professor Renove next to a running car. They lifted their heads at the sound of her approach and waved her over. She smiled as she crossed the last distance between them. For better or for worse, she would be face to face with Pascal again tonight. But this time, she wouldn't be alone. Chapter 28. Their group piled into the car, a red SUV this time, and Professor Hawthorne hauled ass out of the wards and then on toward the Stallion Winery. Deliverance didn't dare try to see the speedometer, worried at what number she would find there, and so she turned her attention inward. Her magic was pulsing with her anxiety, and she tried to soothe it as best she could, stroking Jet's cat's spine to keep her hands occupied. Soon, she promised her magic. I will need you soon, but not quite yet. The car was silent, and no one broke it until they got to the winery gate. It was open, which made Deliverance wonder about why. Was Pascal already here, like Coy said? Professor Hawthorne breezed through the open gate, and Professor Renove turned so that she could see Deliverance, Oliver, and Roman where they were crammed into the back seat. We are here as a precautionary measure, Professor Renove said. Coy told you, Deliverance, that Pascal was probably already here, but I have felt no disturbance in the wards I set. That being said, there are no guarantees when we reach the winery itself. You are both training but remain untrained, and so I must ask that you try to stay out of whatever fight we may or may not have tonight. Deliverance began to protest, but Professor Hawthorne picked up where Renove had left off. We need you and Oliver to trust us. We are experienced beyond what you can even fathom, and we cannot afford to be distracted while trying to protect you. Okay, but what about? That being said, Professor Renove interrupted, we will need you to accompany us to the seal. You, Deliverance, are the only one of us who can see the horseman. If you see War or Coy or anything else along those lines, then you must immediately notify us. Agreed? Deliverance sighed, but nodded her head. Agreed. Good. We'll be arriving shortly. We're here. Deliverance looked through the windshield and saw that Professor Hawthorne had been driving much faster than he had during their first trip. The Stallion Winery loomed before them, all of the windows dark, and Professor Hawthorne brought the car to a screeching halt. They all silently left the car and proceeded to the door. It was ajar, and Deliverance felt an icy finger of dread trace down her spine. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. Something is wrong, Professor Renove said, eerily echoing Deliverance's own thoughts. Alistair? Alistair nodded and stepped forward, pushing the door open. It creaked on rusty hinges, revealing a scene of chaos. Tables and chairs had been overturned, wine bottles lay in broken piles, and the room was thick with an oppressive silence that seemed to echo with cries of long-forgotten terror. Deliverance shivered as if. Professor Hawthorne took a few silent steps toward the door and froze perfectly still. There's blood here, he said softly, an edge to his voice that Deliverance had never heard from him before. A lot of it? Jet pressed his cat form against Deliverance's leg, and she gestured for him to come closer. He zapped into his finch form and flew up to perch on her shoulder. Deliverance tugged at her uniform skirt, wishing she had been given a chance to change clothes. Professor Hawthorne led the way into the building, and as they moved toward the courtyard, Deliverance could just make out the coppery tang of blood. For her to smell it, Professor Hawthorne must have been right. There was a lot of it, but who did it belong to? Oliver took in a sharp breath and clapped a hand over his mouth. Deliverance looked beyond him and saw the crumpled form of Anita slumped against the wall. There was a slash across her throat, and an arc of blood spattered across the wall next to her. That answered the blood question. It also told Deliverance that she had been right to take Coy at his word. Pascal was here. Maybe even Rafa if they had come too late. Deliverance motioned for Oliver to stay back while she surveyed the area, looking for any clues that might lead them to Pascal or Rafa. Her eyes stopped on a door at the end of the hall, and her heart started pounding. If they had taken Anita out there, then it must have been a way out. Chapter 29. Professor Renove knelt by Anita to check for signs of life, but it was clear that she was gone. She pressed her fingers gingerly to the girl's ruined neck, and then shook her head and let her hand fall away. Renove straightened, and then they continued moving toward the courtyard and the statue that concealed the great sword of war. Roman took up a position at the front of their group, which meant that he took the full force of hitting an offensive ward across the hallway. He was thrown back, appearing to be struck by a bolt of red lightning, and Deliverance hurried to where he had fallen, Jet swooping along with her. In her rush, she tripped on his outstretched leg and went sprawling to where Roman had been hit, Jet's momentum carrying him along with her. She braced herself for pain, for electricity, for whatever offensive magic had been woven into the ward, but it never came. She went sprawling through the ward, as if it wasn't even there. Jet spiraled to catch his awkward dive, glancing off the ward, and then zapped into his cat form, managing to land on his feet. He lashed his tail and mewed softly, pacing along the ward's boundary. He couldn't cross, and he meowed in distress, his hackles raised and eyes narrowed into slits. They all stayed there, shocked into silence, and Renove moved her hands into her power position so that she could throw a ball of wind at the ward. It glanced off in a spray of crackling red, but Deliverance was on the other side of it. How had she gotten through? Deliverance, Professor Renove warned, don't even think about it. You need to wait for us to get around this ward, before? But Deliverance had already turned for the courtyard. They didn't have time to wait. She needed to keep Rafa from getting his sword and breaking the second seal. She had to face Pascal again. Alone. She turned the corner and the courtyard came into view, filled with stray bolts of blue-white magic. Deliverance crept toward the door so that she could see, and there she was. Pascal. The psycho bitch, who was trying to end the world for whatever reason. She didn't have time to question Pascali's motives right then, because it was obvious she was trying to break through the professor's warding on the seal. Deliverance couldn't just stand by and do nothing, so she did the first stupid thing that popped into her head. Pascal, she shouted between bolts of magic. Pascali's head whipped around to meet Deliverance's gaze, and the full force of her black eyes hit Deliverance all at once. They weren't a flat black, but a bottomless void. The crackling of her magic danced in her eyes, and she smirked at Deliverance, letting her magic fall away. Ah, chérie, just as I thought. I was wondering when you would show up. Deliverance spread her arms wide. Here I am. Now how about we talk about this like rational people, instead of just pissing each other off? What do you say? In response, Pascal flicked a quick bolt of magic at Deliverance, and she dropped to the ground to avoid it. She quickly scrambled to her feet, and decided she needed to face her head-on. You want to fight? Let's fight for real. Deliverance charged forward while Pascal dropped into her power stance, but Deliverance wasn't looking for a magical fight. At least not yet. She tackled Pascal to the ground. The hit knocking the wind from both of them. Pascal was nothing like Roman, short where he was tall and slight where he was bulky, but from her training Deliverance knew that her stature gave her an edge of quickness. She knew because Roman had said the same about her. They circled each other, both panting to recover their breath, and Deliverance ran through Roman's self-defense lessons. She looked for any weaknesses, a favored side or injured limb, but found none. The only other lesson she could conjure up from the panic in her brain was Roman's favorite line: the best self-defense is not fighting. Always run if you can. Chapter 30. Deliverance couldn't run, not now. Not with Pascal here before her and the second seal still intact. At least she thought it was intact. She glanced over at the statue and saw the orange grid lines of the ward blinking in and out of existence from the force of Pascali's last blast of magic. The glance was enough of an opening for Pascal to dart in and seize Deliverance by the throat. Deliverance clawed at her hand, gasping at air that wouldn't come, and she had a vivid flashback to when Klein had held her off the ground. She hadn't been able to do anything then, too dazed and outmatched to do anything but hang there uselessly, but for once Pascali's stature was a disadvantage. Deliverance's feet were still on the ground. Still holding on to Pascali's vice grip on her throat, Deliverance angled her body to deliver a swift kick at Pascali's exposed ribs. She yelped in pain, and the loss of concentration was enough for Deliverance to wrench free and gasp in precious lungfuls of air. Pascal spun back around, her face twisted into a vicious snarl, and Deliverance saw a spark of madness in her black eyes. Something was driving Pascal, and that made her dangerous. She had the look of someone with nothing to lose, while Deliverance had everything to lose. It was a harsh contrast, and Deliverance hoped it wouldn't come back to bite her in the ass. Assuming she lived long enough for it to do so. Enough of this, Pascal said, her voice dangerously low. I don't need to break the wards by myself. Unlike you, with your pathetic band of heroes trapped behind a simple ward, I have the freedom of movement. The freedom of alliance. And my team is much stronger than yours. Deliverance readied herself to charge at Pascal again, but she was too late. Pascal drew up a ward around herself that zapped Deliverance backwards, then she drew her hands together and muttered something below Deliverance's hearing. A black hole formed between her hands as she kept chanting the spell, and she widened it until it was a full doorway. Just as she had summoned Klein as Pestilence, Pascal was now summoning Rafa. She was summoning the Horsemen of War. Deliverance charged at Pascal again, from different angles, trying to distract her chanting long enough for the doorway to close so that she would have to start over. Pascal gritted her teeth and kept chanting, but Deliverance's tactic was clearly working. The doorway was shrinking as Pascal fought to keep it open. With a frustrated yell, Pascal let the doorway close and turned back to Deliverance. She threw her hands out and pushed a ward at Deliverance. She leapt out of the way, and the ward crashed into the wall of the winery behind her, going straight through it. Deliverance heard the voices of her group approaching the hole in the wall, and Deliverance almost sagged in relief. Backup was on its way, which meant that Deliverance just had to stall Pascal long enough for reinforcements to arrive. She wouldn't have to fight this fight alone, after all. They had a chance. Pascal pulled up another ward, but instead of pushing it at Deliverance, she kept it between them, studying her between the bars of orange. Would you like to see some magic, Deliverance? Some real magic? Wards are a trifle, and summoning spells are a matter of attention spans, but the magic that I can do. She laughed, an evil grin spread across her face. I can do real magic. The magic of life and death, they are mine to command. Would you care to see? Before Deliverance could parse that new information, Pascal lifted a hand toward the hallway where Deliverance had come through and whispered, "Come?" Her voice echoed strangely, and then Deliverance heard shuffling and she was confused. Her people were stuck behind the wards and coming around to the wall Pascal had destroyed. Who else was there to come from this way? Deliverance gasped. She watched in horror as Anita staggered toward them in unsettlingly jerky motions. She held one hand to her ruined throat, and the other was flung out to counterbalance her unwieldy body, and Deliverance whirled back around to face Pascal. She was dead. She is dead. What have you done? How did you? Pascal grinned at her, and Deliverance looked down to see that she had another doorway already half open between her hands. Deliverance looked between Pascal and Anita, weighing her options, but the decision was made for her when Anita lunged at her and made her dive to avoid her outstretched hands. Since Deliverance was in her stupid uniform skirt, the gravel of the courtyard bit harshly into her knees as she caught her fall. Pascal laughed and nodded once to Anita, speaking with the same power that thrummed in her words. Keep her away from me. Chapter 31. Anita immediately began moving toward Deliverance again, and she had to drop all intentions of attacking Pascal. Anita was dead, but her body was throwing itself at her in shuddering movements and making her use her self-defense training to parry the blows. If Pascal was dangerous because she had nothing to lose, Anita was dangerous because she had lost everything. Her life was gone, the only driving force being the will of Pascal, and Deliverance didn't know how to combat an opponent who had no regard for injury or self-preservation. She didn't know what to do. She avoided Anita's wild swings as best she could, glad that Roman's training let her mind move mostly on autopilot, and she knew that she had no chance of making it out of this alive by herself. She needed her people here now. Hurry, she shrieked. Oliver. Renove. Jet. I need you, please. Pascal laughed, the doorway threw wide now, and Rafa steadily walked through the portal, his body turning to face hers. He bowed to Pascal, who nodded back and let the portal close. Your sword is inside the base of the statue, she said casually, gesturing toward the massive wooden sculpture. But it's warded. Help me out, would you? Rafa laughed, sparing a quick glance at Deliverance before dismissing her with a huff. He and Pascal turned their attention to the wards, and bolts of magic shot out from both of their hands, hitting the wards full on. Where Pascali's magic was blue-white like Deliverance's, Rafa's magic was the absence of light. Crackling darkness pushed at the wards, until Deliverance could see them beginning to fade. The wards were failing. Where was her group? Deliverance. We're almost through. Oliver's voice cut through her desperate concentration on keeping Anita from taking her down. It was like fighting a mannequin. One that hated her guts. Anita had no expression on her face, the only movement that of her eyes as they roved over Deliverance looking for an opening. Deliverance was trying her best not to give her anything, but her muscles were beginning to cramp. They had surpassed the level of fatigue she had gotten used to from her sessions with Roman, and their protestations were making themselves known. She gritted her teeth against the pain, but there was only so much she could do. Fuck this, Deliverance thought, blocking another wild swing from Anita. She drew closer to the ward Pascal had placed between them, moving her and Anita closer and closer to the orange grid lines, and then she waited for Anita to strike. It didn't take long, her robotic movements launching her body forward, but this time instead of parrying, Deliverance reached out to snag Anita's arm and pulled with all of her strength. Deliverance used the momentum to pull herself away from the ward, just as she launched Anita into it. Anita made no sound as she was sent flying back, but when she landed she didn't get up. Pascal yelled in frustration, and Deliverance believed she had broken Pascali's hold on Anita's lifeless body. She whirled around, watching in horror as the wards between Rafa and his sword sputtered and died in a fizzle of orange sparks. Laughing, Pascal made an after-you gesture to Rafa, who then strode toward the compartment that held his sword. He reached out and pressed the button Deliverance herself had pressed when her group had first discovered the seal, and a wave of invisible energy slammed into her magic and made her gasp with the force of it. Deliverance dropped to her knees, recovering from the spike of magic, and saw Pascal leaning against the courtyard railing and looking similarly affected. Their eyes met and Pascal smirked. That's too, Cherie. Which means it's time for me to take my leave. I'll even let the pathetic secretary stay dead. I'm sure you'll have your hands plentiful with Rafa. Enjoy and au revoir. Pascal dropped into her power stance and opened a portal like she had to summon Rafa, then hopped into it and was gone. That scheming bitch got away again. Deliverance thought. She'd have to find another way to bring her down. But first, she had to deal with Rafa and the seal. She squared her shoulders and stepped forward, ready for whatever was coming next. The energy of the seal grew brighter as she approached it, but this time she was prepared for its power. With a deep breath and a few words, she was able to dissipate the portal and break the seal without any problems. But there was still one more task at hand, taking care of Rafa. Deliverance steeled herself for battle, and stepped towards the menacing figure that Pascal had summoned. She may have been outnumbered, but she was determined to prevail. Chapter 32. Ah, at last, Rafa said from across the clearing. Don't you do it, you slimy, smoky bastard, she yelled, but it was too late. Rafa had already reached into the secret compartment and withdrew the sword. The rubies in the hilt glinted in the low light, and Rafa's laugh was chilling. She shook herself, trying to work through the shock of everything she had experienced tonight, and pushed it all deep down into the recesses of her mind. She brought her hands into her power stance and forced herself to take a few deep breaths. You ready? Deliverance asked her magic. Take this ward down. She pushed out her hands, and a bolt of blue-white lightning hit the ward in a clash of energy. The orange grid lines began receding, giving way under the blast of blue-white. Deliverance was pouring into it, but it wasn't fast enough. She pushed more of her magic into her efforts, and the orange began dissolving faster. Deliverance. She spared a glance for Oliver's voice, finding him and the rest of her group finally streaming into the clearing. Jet immediately sprinted toward her in cat form, pacing the edge of this ward and yowling his frustration. "Rafa has the sword," she yelled through gritted teeth, still pouring her energy into dismantling the ward. "Watch the sword." She had no idea if anyone else could see Rafa, but she knew that the sword would reveal his location as long as he kept it in his hand. The orange of the ward was almost gone, and Deliverance gave a final push before it finally gave way, and she could pass through it. Jet came to her and rubbed against her, headbutting her calves, and then turned with his back arched so that he could face Rafa. She wanted to collapse in relief at having her familiar back and finally having backup, but she wasn't done yet. They had to separate Rafa from his sword. She turned toward Rafa, who was studying Deliverance and her group with amusement in his eyes. He laughed and drove the tip of the sword into the dirt, then began walking toward Deliverance. The professors and Roman all began throwing offensive spells at and around the sword, but Rafa was no longer there. Klein was foolish to give away his location, but thank you for the reminder that the sword was visible where I was not. "Thank you, Deliverance." Deliverance cringed away, her breathing heavy from the magic drain it took to take down the wards, but she pulled up her shaking hands into her power position anyway. Jet hissed and unsheathed his claws, swiping at the air in front of them as if daring Rafa to try taking them on. Rafa tutted. "Now, Deliverance, don't waste your strength. I find that I'm not really up for trying to extinguish you all. It would be tedious, and I'm delighted to be reunited with my sword after all this time, so I really must be going." "No," Deliverance yelled, pulling magic from her veins and trying to summon enough of it to at least blast Rafa into being visible, but he just chuckled and walked back to his sword. The start of his red smoke curled around his feet. He effortlessly sidestepped the stray bolts of magic her group was desperately flinging at nothing but air. Rafa met her eyes, red smoke swirling around him and obscuring his form. "Come and see." His voice was a chilling purr that traveled across the clearing and made her heart sink. Then he picked up his sword and lifted it to the sky as the smoke enveloped his body. He was gone in a moment, the red smoke dissipating as quickly as it had come. "No," she said again, her words barely a whisper. Pascal was gone, Rafa had his sword and was gone, and she was so tired. "Deliverance." Oliver's voice sounded far away. Deliverance dropped to her knees, then cradled her head in her hands. Oliver ran toward her. He skidded to a stop in front of her, and she caught a glimpse of his copper eyes before his face blurred away. Her body hit the ground. She tried to sit, but was too tired to coordinate her muscles. She felt Jet push against her with his little cat body, and she tried to move her hands to pet him reassuringly, but found that she didn't even have the strength to lift her arms to do that. She had never been so exhausted in her life. "Rafa is gone," Deliverance said shakily. "I'm so tired, Oliver. I just need to sleep for a while." No, Deliverance, you have to stay awake." He caressed the side of her face. Jet curled up next to her, purring. "I need help over here," Oliver shouted, then pulled Deliverance into his arms. The edges of his outline blurred until it was just a few vague shapes, then a handful of colors. Voices came into play, and the urgency of their tones dissolved as she fell into the oblivion of darkness. Chapter 33. Deliverance swam back into consciousness when their car pulled into the school gates and inside the safety of the wards. She groaned, and then Oliver was there, his hand smoothing back her hair gently and his eyes searching hers. "Deliverance," he said, sounding immeasurably relieved, "we're back at school. Can you walk? We need to get you to the infirmary." "Helms first," she croaked. "He needs to know what happened at the second seal. Then I'll go get checked out." Oliver looked like he wanted to protest, but ended up nodding instead. He helped her sit up, and then they got out of the car, Deliverance stumbling a bit when her feet hit the ground. Their group slowly and solemnly made the walk to Headmaster Helms's office, Oliver glued to her side, and Jet perched on her shoulder in Finch form. Helms was waiting for them in his office, and his eyes flicked between each member of their group before settling on Deliverance. He sat up straighter in his desk chair and nodded once. "Tell me what happened." Deliverance let Professors Renove and Hawthorne do most of the talking, but since she was the only one who had faced Pascal, she had to run through everything that happened. She explained that she had tried to keep Pascal from opening the portal to summon Rafa, but that Pascal had raised a ward and then Anita, to keep her from interfering. "Anita was dead when you first found her. You're sure?" "Yes, Headmaster," Professor Hawthorne said for her. "She lost more blood than any human could have withstood, and her heart had stopped." Helms sank into his chair. Not much, but more than Deliverance had ever seen him before. It was almost as if he had wilted, and for a split second he looked as exhausted as she felt. The moment passed, and Helms sat up straight once more. "Oliver," he said, "will you escort Ms. Mackey to the infirmary? I need to speak with the professors and Roman alone." Oliver bobbed his head and took Deliverance's arm. She hesitated, pulling weakly against his arm so that she could continue to face Headmaster Helms. "Why did I go through the wards when no one else could? How is that possible?" Helms shook his head, steepling his fingers before him. "I'm not entirely sure, though if I had to guess, I would say that Pascal designed the ward so that only you could go through. She sounds like she is the type who wants an audience for herself, and so that makes the most sense to me." "Headmaster," she said, hoping that using his title would get his attention, "what Pascal did with Anita, what was that? I've never heard of magic that can raise the dead and use them as puppets. We need to know what we're up against." She paused, then amended, "I need to know." Helms looked at her critically, obviously weighing his answer carefully. "What you witnessed, Ms. Mackey, was necromancy. Advanced necromancy by the sound of it, which makes Pascal even more dangerous than we had previously thought." "But I didn't think necromancy was real," Deliverance said, her voice small. "I thought it was just a myth to make witches sound scarier than we are." "It is very rare," Helms said. "Necromancers are one of the few Class 7 magic users, and they are taught very carefully so that they understand the ethics of their powers. Pascal, if she is a necromancer, has abandoned her teachings and can now safely be classified as a rogue witch." Deliverance waited for him to continue, prompting him for the answers she needed. "What happens to rogue witches?" Helms shook his head, his mouth a grim line. "Rogue witches are pursued, detained, and if they cannot be rehabilitated, then they are executed. Declaring Pascal a rogue witch means that the council will need to be involved. I will begin the process of calling the cavalry, as you might say." He gave Deliverance a weak smile, and then turned his attention back to the professors and Roman. She and Oliver were clearly dismissed. As they went to leave, Helms called out to them. "Be careful," he said softly. "Rogue witches are powerful and dangerous." Deliverance nodded in agreement, her mind already spinning on the implications of Pascali's status as a rogue witch. She knew she had to act fast if they were going to save her. She and Oliver hurried out of the room, ready to start their mission. But first things first, they had to find Pascal before it was too late. With a feeling of urgency, Deliverance reached for her map and began plotting their course. It was time to find Pascal, and hopefully save her before the council stepped in and took matters into their own hands. But first, there was something else Deliverance had to do: find out as much information about Pascali's situation as possible so they could devise a plan of action. She knew she couldn't go into this blindly. She needed all the knowledge she could get before charging into battle. Chapter 34. Deliverance let Oliver lead her out of the headmaster's office, and they began the slow walk across campus to the infirmary. It felt like years ago that she had sprinted down these paths, full of energy and strength. Now she felt like a husk of her usual self. She had thoroughly depleted her magic, but was too tired to be scared of what that meant. Well, almost too tired. Jet zapped into his flying squirrel form, so that he could latch onto her wrist, and she was comforted by the closeness of her familiar, even if his tiny body did feel like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She was grateful that Oliver was there. She knew that he would catch her if she stumbled and fell. Almost there, he murmured soothingly, his arm around her shoulders. She wanted to look up at him, to see his beautiful copper eyes, but she didn't trust her balance, and so she kept her eyes forward. Just because she trusted Oliver to not let her fall, didn't mean she was trying to test that trust. She was so tired. She just wanted to curl up in a bed and sleep for 12 hours, and she hoped that at the infirmary they would let her do just that. They walked in relative silence, only broken by quiet reassurances from Oliver and soft chirps from Jet, and Deliverance was glad that she didn't have to talk. Rehashing everything with Helms had drained her, and small talk was completely off the table. Her thoughts were swimming with information, all of it blurring together into a giant mess. Boards, necromancy. Pascal. They arrived at the infirmary, and were greeted by a round woman who quickly got Deliverance into a bed. Before she could pitch forward and fall into blessed unconsciousness again, the nurse cleaned and dressed her shallow cuts and scrapes from the fight with Pascal, taking extra care for the deepest gashes from where Deliverance had landed on her knees in the gravel, and checked to see if anything was broken. Once it was determined that she would live, the nurse gave Deliverance a glass of orange liquid and instructed her to drink. "What is it?" "Orange juice," she said briskly. "With some iron enrichment to help you get your strength back. Regenerating your magic will take time. You are at dangerously low levels from what I can tell, but I can at least start setting your body to rights. Now bottoms up and then you can sleep." Deliverance, motivated by the prospect of sleep, threw back the glass of juice and then handed it back to the nurse. It tasted like normal orange juice, but even if the nurse was trying to drug her, Deliverance couldn't bring herself to care. The nurse could whack her over the head with a frying pan, and Deliverance wouldn't mind, as long as she got to sleep. Deliverance lay down on the blessedly soft bed, and rounded her body so that Jet had a place to sleep in his cat form. He jumped into the bed, spun once, and then plopped down with his whiskers brushing the tip of her nose. Deliverance sighed and glanced at Oliver, who was hovering nervously nearby. "Go see Tasha," Deliverance said hoarsely. "I'll be fine. I'll let you know when I rejoin the land of the living." Oliver blanched, and Deliverance chuckled at her poor choice of words. She was going to correct herself, had every intention of opening her mouth and giving him back some reassurance of his own, but she was falling, and then was claimed by the blackness and warmth of dreamless sleep. Deliverance spent the next 18 hours floating in and out of consciousness, roused only long enough to drink fluids and eat some simple food before falling back asleep. It was dreamless for the most part, but now and then the blackness would tint with the swirling of gray smoke, and she would feel eyes watching her sleeping form only to wake and find no one there. Once, Deliverance cracked her eyes and found the blurry image of a nun standing above her. Before she could verify her shaky view, the darkness claimed her again, but the sound of whispered prayers filtered down into her dreams and echoed around her while slowly her body began to recover. Chapter 35. By the time she was allowed out of the infirmary, 3 days after she had first arrived, Deliverance was antsy and impatient. She bounced on her heels as the intake nurse reminded her about eating healthy and drinking water so that her magic could recover as much as her body. And when she was cleared, she jogged out of the building with Jet in cat form trotting at her side. After Deliverance's long sleep, she had woken up angry. Now that she wasn't bone-tired and had officially survived her encounter with Pascal, she wanted to punch something to vent her frustration, and she knew just where to go. She stopped by her room so that she could change into athletic clothes, and then texted Oliver to let him know she would be going to the rec hall to get some sparring training in. Oliver peppered her with questions, asking if she was sure she was up to it, and she rolled her eyes but smiled anyway. He was just looking out for her. She knew that. She assured Oliver that she was just going to be sparring with Roman, or a punching bag if she couldn't find the Guardian, and on a whim she asked if he wanted to join her. He made his excuses and Deliverance sighed. He was obviously still shying away from physical training, but he would come around. Not like he had a choice. Deliverance didn't have one either. There were 2 seals cracked of 7, and Pascal had once again gotten the better of them. Deliverance had thought they would be better prepared, and she had even taken a group of people with her this time, but still it wasn't enough. They would have to figure out something different for the third seal, and fast. She jogged to the rec hall, texting Roman as she went. A message pinged back from him, and Deliverance felt her face fall. Roman was in an Academy Guardian assembly, and wouldn't be available for another hour or two. She huffed, squaring her shoulders and approaching the lines of punching bags. This would have to do. An hour later, Deliverance had worked up a sweat, and her hands were aching from where she had been pummeling one of the punching bags. She was taking a break, sitting on the mat and drawing a long pull from a water bottle when she saw Roman turn the corner and their eyes met. He hurried over and squatted so that they were level with one another. "Deliverance," he said, "how are you feeling?" "Better," she admitted, flashing him a grin. "Want to spar? I could use an opponent that actually swings back at me." Roman frowned. "I would prefer we wait until you have further recovered from the fight with Pascal. You cannot push too hard so that your magic can come back in full force. Physical strength will mean nothing if your magic remains depleted." Deliverance groaned theatrically, but her thoughts snagged on Roman's words. He was right. She felt almost naked without the now familiar thrum of magic singing in her blood, which is why she had needed the fresh air and physical activity. She chose to punch because it made her feel better. She was multitasking. "You should go get some rest," Roman said gently. "All I've been doing is resting." "Physically, yes." Deliverance paused at that. Roman had a point, in an annoying way. She waved her hand at him. Fine. I'll go rest. Can we spar tomorrow morning before classes though? I don't want to go too long without any training. After all, I've worked pretty hard for this physique." She flexed her puny bicep and Roman cracked a smile. "Tomorrow," he promised. He stood and held out a hand to help her up, grasping her forearm while she grasped his. Once he had made sure she was on her feet, he nodded once and strode back the way he had come. Deliverance whistled softly to wake Jet up from his catnap, and he raised his head sleepily, eyes still slitted, mostly shut. "How can you still be sleepy?" she asked him. "Come on, shower time." Jet meowed at her and stretched languidly before trotting after her. She decided to avoid the rec hall showers, in favor of the shower in her room. She managed to cross campus without running into anyone she knew, but on the steps of the dorm, she ran into Lexi. Because of fucking course, she did. "What do you want, Lexi?" Deliverance asked, without preamble. "Oh, Deliverance," she said, scanning her up and down once, her eyes huge in mock concern. "You look dreadful. Have you been sleeping okay?" Deliverance's first instinct was to deck Lexi there and then, her hands itching to do it, especially after just spending an hour punching the bags, but she shoved it down. Her second instinct was to tell Lexi all about why she looked so damn dreadful. She imagined the conversation in her head. "You know, staving off the literal apocalypse wrecks your beauty sleep, but I'm hanging in there. Thanks for asking, you animatronic bitch." She opted for neither, crossing her arms instead and waiting for whatever else Lexi had to say. When she was met with silence, Deliverance waved her hand in a cycling "I haven't got all day" gesture. "If you didn't actually want anything, then you're in the way of me and my shower." Lexi's nose wrinkled, apparently taking in Deliverance's general sweaty and disheveled appearance she had earned after working the bag for an hour. "Right. I should let you do that. Tell Oliver." "Oh, forget it, I'll just text him. He's always on that phone of his, as I'm sure you've noticed." Deliverance stilled, but kept an annoyed look plastered on her face. Lexi is right. Oliver was always on his phone. But she had assumed he had been playing games or texting other people. Surely, he hadn't been actually texting Lexi through all of this. Jet zapped into his Finch form, flying a circle around Lexi's head before perching on Deliverance's shoulder and staring at her with his beady bird eyes. Lexi flinched away from Jet, probably remembering how much of a little terror he could be when he put his mind to it, and Deliverance couldn't help but smile. "Right," she said, uncrossing her arms and walking straight toward Lexi. She was satisfied when Lexi leapt out of the way, probably to avoid getting any grime on her stupidly perfect uniform, and she made herself keep walking at a steady pace. Jet hopped around so that he was facing backwards and could stare down Lexi as they left her behind. "Who knows, Jet," she said as she walked them upstairs to her room. "Maybe you'll get a new bird form with talons, and then you can practice sharpening them on Lexi's face. What do you say?" Jet chirped and sidestepped on her shoulder so that he could rub against the side of her face. Deliverance grinned. Chapter 36. Deliverance and Jet were almost back to her room, but when the duo turned the corner, they ran straight into Sister Sophronia Newton. The sister jumped back, as if Deliverance had thrown boiling water on her, clutching her rosary to her chest and everything. Deliverance raised an eyebrow. Sister. What are you doing here?" Sister Sophronia Newton looked afraid of Deliverance, truly afraid, and Deliverance was confused. There had been animosity between them before, sure, but never fear. What was going on? Deliverance took a step forward with her hands out as if comforting a skittish animal, and Sister Sophronia Newton took a step back, cowering and holding the cross of her rosary out at Deliverance like it was a weapon. Deliverance huffed. "This again. Sister, you know I'm not actually possessed, right? I'm a witch, a magic user, whatever makes you happy, but I'm not possessed. I'm also really not in the mood for this right now. So I'm just going to go to my room. We cast you out, every unclean spirit, every satanic power, every onslaught of the infernal adversary." Deliverance watched in shock as Sister Sophronia Newton, her frail body shaking with fear and effort, began moving toward her with the cross still raised. She chanted slowly. The words grew stronger as she spoke more fervently. "Sister. Every legion, every diabolical group and sect, in the name and by the power of our Lord Jesus Christ. We command you, be gone. Sister." Sister Sophronia Newton paid her words no attention, moving closer and closer with her rosary held aloft like it would ward the evil in Deliverance away. Her voice was raised even higher now, and Deliverance glanced around the hall. She needed to end this before the nun had drawn the attention of the entire fucking dorm. "And fly far from the Church of God, from the souls made by God in His image, and redeemed by the precious blood of the divine Lamb." Deliverance gritted her teeth. All of her frustration was boiling to the surface, and she felt small sparks of magic responding to her anger. Maybe that's what the sister needed, a little demonstration to see what magic was. Maybe then Deliverance would finally, for the first time in her life, not be subject to the judgment of nuns. Especially this particular nun. "I am not possessed." She spat at the sister, dropping her hands into a power position. She knew that her magic was still dangerously low, but she wasn't looking for power today. She just wanted a light show. Deliverance asked her magic quietly, "I need light from you," and a ball of blue-white light began fizzing between her palms. She expanded her hands and felt a tug as her magic hit its current limit. It was even lower than Deliverance had expected, but she knew this wouldn't take long. "May the Holy Cross be my light. May the dragon never be my guide. Begone, Satan. Never tempt me." The sister's eyes fixed on the ball of light, and her chanting turned into a keening wail before she clutched her rosary back to her chest and ran down the hall surprisingly fast. Deliverance let the light fade out, and when she looked back up, Sister Sophronia Newton was at the end of the hall. "You, Deliverance Mackey, are not beyond saving. You will be exorcised and saved. I will do it." Deliverance groaned and threw up her hands into the air, turning for her room. Jet zapped into his cat form and dropped to the ground so that he could hiss at the good sister. She watched Jet's transformation and shrieked, and Deliverance had to laugh. "The devil is upon you, Deliverance. He is all around you. Take heed." Deliverance ushered Jet inside the room and closed the door behind her, cutting off the nun's tirade. She understood what Sister Sophronia meant. Deliverance was in real trouble. But what could she do? She sat on the bed with Jet in her lap and thought about her options. The answer came to her quickly. She would seek out an exorcist who could help free her from this curse before it was too late. Chapter 37. Jet trotted to the bed and jumped neatly onto Deliverance's pillow, making her roll her eyes. "Buddy, that's my pillow." Jet let out a murrow and Deliverance sighed and sat next to him on the bed, pulling him into her lap so that she could kiss him on his furry little forehead. Jet immediately began purring, and she stroked down his spine while she thought about her encounters with Lexi and then with Sister Sophronia Newton. She certainly could have handled herself better with both of them, but it was very unfair of the universe to put them back to back like that. She thought about what Lexi had said, that she would text Oliver herself, and Deliverance's traitorous mind began pulling up memories of Oliver quickly putting his phone away whenever they met up. So, he was on his phone a lot. Tons of people spent a lot of time on their phones. It didn't mean that he was secretly harboring a relationship with the bitchiest thorn in Deliverance's side. It just meant that, well, she sighed. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew that she needed to get her jealousy under control. There's nothing to be jealous of. She chided herself. Oliver is with me now, and Lexi can be as bitchy as she wants. It isn't going to change that fact. Deliverance did feel a little bit bad about spooking the sister, but she had started it by trying to exorcise her in the middle of the fucking hallway. She remembered how the rosary had been brandished like a weapon, a talisman to ward off the evil inside Deliverance. But there was no evil. Deliverance was just herself. The sister would have to get used to that, or she could fuck right off for all Deliverance cared. She gave Jet one last stroke down his spine before standing and walking to her bathroom. Time for a very long, very hot shower. Jet followed her inside, and jumped up onto the counter before zapping into his salamander form, ready to bask in the steam of the shower. Deliverance laughed and obliged, turning on the shower and undressing while the water got hot. When she finally stepped underneath the spray, she breathed a sigh of relief. She was alive, and she had her familiar on her side, which meant that everything else would be manageable. Plus, her magic would be growing steadily stronger the longer she let it rest, which meant that she would have her magic on her side too. She washed her hair and body, and then stretched under the water and willed the knots in her neck and back to loosen. While she waited for her magical battery to recharge, she would be able to pick her self-defense training back up with Roman. She had sort of held her own with Pascal, but she knew there was still plenty of room for improvement. She was already looking forward to the sparring session of the next day, and ran through a mental checklist of what she wanted to tell Roman about her adversary. Small and slight, stupidly perfect hair, and she paused mid-stretch as an idea occurred to her. She hadn't seen Pascal with a familiar. She walked back through her memory of that night, from seeing her in the courtyard until she disappeared through the portal, and Deliverance still could find no trace of a familiar. Unless it was small enough to fit in a pocket, as Jet's mouse form had been, then Pascali's familiar could be anything. It was another wild card just like Pascal herself, and Deliverance sighed. They knew so little about Pascal, other than the fact that she was a rogue witch trying to end the world. Maybe she could ask Petty Boy to pull some strings. She didn't just come from nowhere, and if necromancers were so rare and powerful, then she must have made some waves during her training. If they could learn more about Pascal as a witch, as a person, then maybe they would find some way to beat her the third time around. It was worth a try, at least. With that in mind, Deliverance and Jet set off to find out what they could about Pascali's past. They started by visiting her old coven, but the necromancer had been gone for so long that none of the witches living there knew anything about her. Chapter 38. Deliverance got out of the shower and dried her hair with a towel. She quickly brushed it, and then tied it up into a bun on the top of her head to dry as it saw fit. She scooped up a very happy and moisturized Jet, and brought him back into the bedroom. She dressed in comfy clothes, and then flopped onto her bed, ready for a night of relaxing before she picked up her classes again the next day. Jet was back in cat form. It was obviously his new favorite form since the mouse one was gone, and he curled up on her lap and promptly fell asleep. Deliverance shook her head. "Oh, to be a cat that could nap wherever and whenever she pleased. She pulled out a book, and then settled in to read, cozy and warm from the residual heat of the shower. She held the book with one hand and idly stroked Jet's head with the other, but she had trouble getting lost in the story. Her mind was still whirring with thoughts, and they didn't allow for much of anything else. She groaned and let her head fall back so that she could stare at the ceiling. She just wanted a normal night, just a single normal night. Jet's ears flicked against her hand and then he raised his head, staring at the corner of her room by the closet. Deliverance froze. The last time Koi had arrived, Jet had been the first one aware of him. She was already learning the value of trusting her familiar's heightened senses, and so she carefully stood from her bed and kept her eyes on the floor around where Jet was staring. Sure enough, wisps of gray smoke began curling in the corner, coalescing into a pillar and then solidifying into the form of Koi. He dressed exactly as he had been before, in a stuffy gray three-piece suit and looking at her with amusement. Deliverance. Koi. She made a show of giving him a head-to-toe once-over. Still going for the accountant chic, I see. Gotta say, doesn't really work for you. There's no need to be rude, Koi said with a sniff. Didn't I help you find Pascal again? A lot of good that did, Deliverance grumbled. Koi looked offended. No thanks? Nothing at all. Why, if I hadn't told you about her whereabouts, you wouldn't have even had a fighting chance. Those wards weren't going to do much good all on their own. Deliverance frowned. Koi was right. She remembered Professor Renaud saying that she hadn't felt any disturbance in the wards she and Professor Hawthorne had set in place around the seal. Why would Pascal not have set them off? It's all in the wording of the spell, Koi said. Deliverance looked up. She hadn't meant to ask her question out loud. What do you mean? What does the wording have to do with anything? Koi sighed. Dearest Deliverance, I can't do all the work for you, that wouldn't be fair or fun, and I'm all about both. His curling smile made Deliverance want to gag. She was so not in the mood for Koi, and his stupid dramatics encroaching on her downtime. Did you want something, Koi? I'm kind of busy here. I wanted to check in and see how you were doing after your little spat with dear Pascal. Little spat. Deliverance rolled her eyes. I'm fine. Thank you for checking in. Now if you don't mind, I'm trying to unwind. Unwind from what exactly? Your mundane little life as a witch among men? Yeah, sure, whatever you say. I noticed you have a Sister of the Temple of Mercy Louis here at your precious little academy, Koi said, changing topic and causing Deliverance to whip her head up so that their eyes could meet. Sister Sophronia Newton, I believe her name is? Deliverance frowned. How would you know Sister Sophronia Newton? Koi laughed dryly. She's very fond of her exorcisms. I watched her try to do one on you in the hallway. It was actually quite entertaining. Deliverance shuddered at the reminder that Koi could visit her whenever he wanted. She crossed her arms across her chest and refused to think about the fact that not long ago she had been naked in the shower. She wasn't used to the constant attention, and it stressed her out enough that she pushed it to the back of her mind whenever she could. Whenever it was brought back to the forefront, she was always uncomfortable. Koi, I'm tired, so let's cut to the chase. Did you want something? Other than to check in on me, or whatever? She made air quotes around the words, and laced her voice with as much sarcasm as she possibly could. Not really, just to let you know that there is some merit to the good sister's intentions. Exorcisms exist for a reason after all. Sure, the sister has been a little overzealous in her assumptions, but she hasn't been wrong on all of them. Most but not all. Deliverance narrowed her eyes. So you're telling me that I'm possessed? By who? You. Koi waved a hand at her. I forgot how terribly boring all of your incessant questions can be. I'll leave you to unwind, as you said. I'll be in touch, and remember, there's nowhere that I can't find you. Wait. But Koi was already dissolving back into smoke, and soon enough all traces of him had vanished from the room. Deliverance watched Jet for any sign that Koi might still be hanging around, but her familiar's hackles fell and he started cleaning his whiskers, which she took as a sign that they were alone again. She went back to the bed and sat down heavily. What had Coy meant? Merit in the sister's intentions, what did that mean? All thoughts of a relaxing night had vanished completely, so Deliverance sighed and stood up. She went to gather her notebooks into her backpack and grab some shoes. She decided not to change clothes on principle. She turned back to Jet and found him studying her curiously, his head cocked to one side. Come on, Jet, she said with a long-suffering sigh. We're going to the library. Chapter 39. It was a quiet trek across campus, and Deliverance let herself and Jet into the library. There were a few gatherings of students, and Deliverance felt a bit out of place without her uniform, but she kept her head down and went back through the stacks to the table she had now claimed as her own for when she and Oliver did seal research. She had to stifle a groan when she realized that they would be doing even more seal research, since Pascal had successfully cracked the second one. Research was the worst, but at least she would have Oliver to suffer through it with her. Deliverance laid out her notebooks and then had Jet stay with her things. He complied, curling up in his cat form on top of her notebook and laying down, his twitching ears the only indication that he was still awake. She went to one of the library computers and did a few searches, then wrote down some reference numbers into her phone, and then began her tour through the stacks to find what she needed. It took about 15 minutes of searching, but when she returned to the table, she had a stack of books in hand that she had checked out and could be taken back to her room with her later. The titles included the only 2 books with mentions of necromancy in the library database, warding spell books so that Deliverance could check the incantation wordings, and theories behind exorcisms analyzed in the context of magic users. As Coy had said, exorcisms had been around for a long time. Way before magic users and non-magic users had brokered an uneasy truce with the help of the council. The fact that they were still being used after that peace had been struck meant that there could be some valid use for them. If demons existed, then possession was a reasonable possibility. Deliverance looked at the stack of books, and at Jet blatantly sleeping in front of her, and she felt how heavy her eyes were. She had classes in the morning, with sparring beforehand if Roman followed through, and she needed sleep so that she could start the day fresh. But she had already spent so long sleeping. She couldn't help but feel that they were running out of time, that there would be no normal to return to if Pascal kept cracking seals. She shook her head to clear her panic away, and gingerly lifted Jet onto the cushioned chair beside her. She figured she may as well use the library space for now, knowing that once she was back in her room she would be tempted to sleep, so she opened the first book, Theory of Demonic Possession. The first section was about the different types of demons, and she decided to start there. Coy had admitted that he was a demon, and Deliverance wanted to know what exactly that entailed. She found references to mayhem and mischief, which both sounded right up Coy's alley, and so she made a note of those demons, and then a word caught her eye. Apocalypse. She followed the entry to a demon who was known for mayhem and mischief, and who had been referenced in relation to the 7 seals of the apocalypse. Deliverance wrote out the word apocalypse at the top of her page, but her tired eyes accidentally wrote it as apocalypse. She squinted at the words and on a hunch separated the letters out. Coy apples. Coy la pesa. Coy sepala. She sat back, staring at the words. She opened her phone to the first notes draft she had made after meeting Coy and the horseman for the first time when she had been trying to summon Jet. In the note she had written Coy sepala, SP? But she knew now that she had spelled it wrong. Coy had said it himself when they had first met, that he was commonly known as Apocalypse, but at the time Deliverance had thought he was just being a megalomaniac. He had given her his name, and Deliverance hadn't once thought to research it. She smacked her forehead with her hand. She felt so behind, so guilty that this was the first time she was realizing this, but she pulled back her spiraling thoughts. When composed, she went back to the index and started scrolling down the entries again, skipping the demon section this time. Even beyond this revelation that Coy was a potentially researchable force, Deliverance couldn't stop thinking about the fact that Coy had said Sister Sophronia Newton's belief that Deliverance was possessed had merit. She had bodily autonomy, so the movie versions of possession were out, which is why she needed more information. She continued running through the index entries, discarding each one until she reached one of the last sections, titled Haunting Possession versus Physical Possession. She followed the page guide and went to the corresponding page and then began to read. Chapter 40. Apparently, there were rare cases where possession wasn't a battle of wills, but rather a tethering in which both parties kept their autonomy. The book called this a haunting possession, but Deliverance shortened it to haunt, to make it easier for her to remember. Being haunted by a demon wasn't the same as being possessed, so traditional exorcisms weren't effective. If the demon discovered that there was an attempt to exorcise them, they could simply leave and keep the tether intact. The only way to break a haunting possession tether was for the haunted party to do the exorcism. Deliverance sat back in her chair and said, "Ha," softly to herself. She could be rid of Coy. She just needed to perform an exorcism on herself. It was almost definitely much more complicated than that, but Deliverance took heart that she wasn't going to be stuck with Coy for the rest of her life. She noted the page number, and then stilled with her pen still pressed to the paper. As much as she wanted to be out of Coy's and his creepy stalker tendencies, he had been the reason why they had managed to reach Pascal in time at the second seal. Sure, they hadn't stopped her, but they wouldn't even have known she was there without Coy nudging her along. If she exorcised Coy, would that go away? Could they afford to have that connection and potential edge go away? She decided that she needed to keep this particular piece of information to herself. It was enough that she knew Coy could be eventually exorcised, but she didn't want anyone else trying to make a decision for her. Pete's play-by-the-rules Helms certainly wouldn't abide having a student that was possessed by a demon, haunting or otherwise. Or he would swing in the complete opposite direction, and not let Deliverance exorcise him if the time came when she wanted to. No, Deliverance would have to keep that to herself. She laughed suddenly, realizing that if and when she wanted to exorcise Coy, Sister Sophronia Newton would be her best source of information. That would be a real doozy of a conversation. "Hey sister, remember how you wanted to exorcise me? Well, you were wrong, but only kind of, and now I need your help to exorcise myself, but I have to do it." She would avoid that conversation as long as possible, but a small part of her couldn't wait to see the look on the good sister's face when she did. The next few hours were a blur of note-taking so that she could bring some findings to the independent study with Renove in the morning. Since Renove set the wards, she wanted to talk with the professor about which spell she had used and what the wording was. There had to be a reason why Pascal hadn't set off the wards. And then she had the 2 books with mentions of necromancy, but she already knew that it wouldn't be enough. She would have to get that information straight from Helms, which was a daunting thought. But maybe he could help piece together the pieces of Pascal, so that they could find a record of the witch she had been before everything had shattered into now. No one ends the world for kicks. There's always some reason. They just had to figure out what that reason was for Pascal. But that was all for the upcoming days and weeks. For the rest of the night, she would focus her attention on learning more about possessions. Or she supposed hauntings in her case. She took notes as she went, keeping a list of observations and references in the margins, and resigned herself to a night of study instead of sleep. After all, it's better the evil you know than the one you don't. Coy knew almost everything about her, and it was starting to piss her off. It's time to level the playing field. She was determined to be the hero of her own story, and the only way to do that was to learn as much as she could about this mysterious force living inside of her. Perhaps then she would find a way to break free. It was time for Pascal to take action, time for her to become the witch she had always wanted to be. She scoured the internet for any information about possession, hauntings, and other supernatural phenomena. She read through old grimoires and haunted histories, looking for any clues that could help her understand what was happening to her. As she went deeper down a rabbit hole of knowledge, Pascal started to realize why she had been chosen as a vessel for this otherworldly force. With each new discovery, Pascal became more emboldened in her mission to take control of her life and master the power inside of her. She practiced her newly acquired skills daily, determined to gain mastery over the spirits that inhabited her body.